Chapter 26:47. What was different from before was that as the four small banners waved, a strange wave of energy was produced and spread rapidly in all directions. Wherever the ripples passed, the images formed by the broken swords would collapse. Swords that seemed like broken swords and sword intents would break down from the images, and they would be swept up into the sky like sand dunes by the wind. A feeling of annihilation rose in the hearts of all the sword cultivators. A feeling of disbelief rose in their hearts at the same time. They had never imagined that the Dao Sex array would be so mysterious. Buzz, the moment the sword world broke down, LV Ruochang and the other huge swords did not give GMO and the others any chance to wave the small banners again. At the same time, dozens of terrifying auras, mixed with absolute sword chi, attacked GMO and the others. Under the impact of the sword chi, the waves of energy from the four small banners showed signs of stagnation. In fact, the broken swords within a few hundred feet of the waves were showing signs of reforming again. The sword mountain and sword water were gradually returning to their original state. Kill! The swordsmen were overjoyed when they saw this. Hundreds of thousands of swordsmen roared in unison and summoned their flying swords. The flying swords danced and formed dozens of huge flying swords, flashing brilliantly as they slashed down at the sword mountain in the distance that was beginning to return to its original state. The flying swords were about to hit the swordsman. If the sword mountain was hit, it would only collapse. Once the sword mountain collapsed, the entire golden destruction array would naturally have a flaw. However, at this critical moment, a cold voice came from the distant horizon. So, you've been waiting for the golden destruction array. You want to break my golden destruction array with just 100,000 flying swords? What wishful thinking. At the place where the voice came from, the entire sword mountain collapsed like quicksand. The quicksand flowed rapidly from that place, and all the illusions in the golden destruction array instantly turned into nothingness. Xiong Huasong, Heng Li, and several other mid-golden core cultivators appeared at the origin of the collapse of the illusions. As they waved their banners, raindrops, waves, and mountain-like broken swords rushed toward the flying swords of the swordsmen. Rumble, rumble, endless sounds rang out, and earth-shattering explosions rang out. The entire golden destruction formation was in a state of chaos, and it was like a scene from purgatory. In the entire world, there were only swords, sword light, and sword chi. Fellow Taoist Ji. Xiong Huasong yelled in exasperation. Hurry up and activate the golden destruction formation. It turned out that even though Xiong Huasong and the others were able to control the broken swords of the golden destruction formation, they were still unable to activate the bone-corroding golden light of the golden destruction formation. Even though the thousands of broken swords could withstand the attacks of the 100,000 sword cultivators for a short period of time, they were absolutely unable to withstand the attacks of the sword cultivators for a long period of time, let alone kill the sword cultivators. Wang, several loud and clear sounds of swords rang out amidst the violent explosion. Although it was not as powerful as before, it was just as resounding. Boom! An extremely loud sound rang out at the end of the first wave of attacks. The attacks of LV Ruochang and the others had collided with the attacks of GMO and the others. The sound this time was not as loud as before, but the entire formation shook violently. All the cultivators and swordsmen were unable to stand firm in midair, and they all staggered as they tried their best to maintain their balance. The expressions of the bystanders were, of course, shocked by the power of the formation, but Xiong Huasong's face was pale, and he was extremely anxious. This was because he knew that GMO and the others were at the base of the golden destruction formation. This base was not fixed within the formation, but GMO and the others had not completely activated the golden destruction formation. The base of the formation was beneath their feet. If LV Ruochang and the others' giant swords killed GMO and the others, the base of the formation would also be destroyed, and all the Dao Sect's previous efforts would be for naught. How could Xiong Huasong dare to be negligent? He waved the banner in his hand. and another part of the sword will of heaven and earth seeped in. Seemingly endless flying swords rushed into the formation and flew in the direction of the giant swords. Hung Zhao and the others naturally came to their senses, and all their attacks were temporarily directed towards the giant swords. Rumble! Another series of explosions rang out, and sword splendor filled the entire formation. Not only did everyone feel dizzy, but they also did not dare to release their divine senses. The power of the Golden Destruction formation and the countless remnant sword wills had caused great damage to their divine senses. LV Ruochang and the others were in a dilemma. Wherever the giant swords were, the sword chi had already blocked the sword rain that GMO and the others had summoned. Even Ruo Ling's sword light had pierced towards Ji Hong's eyes. Under the sword light, the small banner's golden light only flashed slightly before being annihilated. As long as LV Ruochang and the others put in more effort, this Golden Destruction formation would be destroyed. It was a pity that Xiong Huasong and the others' assistance was timely. The monstrous sword rain hit the dozens of giant swords, and the sword splendor of the third grade, illusory swordsmen were disrupted. Facing the fierce sword rain and the sword will that seemed to be driven by tens of thousands of cultivators, these swordsmen were helpless. They could only retreat slightly. Of course, it was during this slight retreat that four sword-like golden lights appeared in the air amidst the splashes of sword radiance. These four sword lights suddenly exploded and turned into tens of thousands of crystal fragments that shot out in all directions of the sword formation. What a pity! When LV Ruochang saw the golden lights appear, she knew that the bone-corroding golden light was not stopped. She felt that it was a pity. At the same time, she hurriedly activated the sword origin, and the entire giant sword flashed with the sword will of the phoenix. This sword will slowly converged, and a faint fluctuation was slowly emitted. This fluctuation swayed along with the sword light, as if it was breathing. It was emitted by LV Ruochang, who had yet to merge the sword spirit and sword will into the sword heart. Swoosh! The golden light shot out in all directions like the rising sun and plated the entire Golden Destruction array with a layer of golden light. This golden light had already touched the broken sword will and thousands of broken swords, and immediately bloomed with a strong brilliance. Oh no! All the disciples of the Black Phoenix Sword Sect shouted in their hearts. The other disciples of the Sword Gate had only heard about it, but they had personally experienced it. What kind of golden light was that? What kind of bone-corroding golden light was that? The pain was definitely not something that could be described with words. The golden light flashed without much noise. In this array where the swords clashed and the sounds of the swords clashing were incessant, it was nothing at all. However, wherever the golden light passed, the sword light of the swordsmen melted and their sword chi was corroded. Hundreds and thousands of screams were heard. Among the screams, hundreds and thousands of disciples who were pregnant with swords fell from the sky in batches, their bodies covered in blood. In the midst of the blood, eerie white bones could be seen. Chapter 2648. In an instant, all the swordsmen panicked. It was not that the disciples of the Black Phoenix Sword Sect had not mentioned such a situation before, but to them, it was something new. Everyone felt that they could resist this strange golden light. Only now did they truly believe that there was something they could not resist within the Dao Sect's array. As soon as the golden light flashed, the figures of GMO and the others disappeared. The base of the array was also hidden within the array. Xiong Huasong and the others also revealed a trace of a smile on their faces. As the flagpoles swayed, their figures also disappeared into the air. At this moment, the golden light once again landed on the huge sword that LV Ruochang had transformed into. The fluctuation of the sword heart combined with the sword radiance cleverly dodged the golden light. Even when some of the golden light touched the sword radiance swayed slightly, as though it was cruising within the golden light. The speed at which the sword essence was melting was much slower than before. However, this bone-corroding golden light was too powerful. LV Ruochang was already on the verge of transforming into a sword. He already had a secret technique, but he still could not completely resist this golden light. If this continued for too long, he would still die. With LV Ruochang in such a state, the other illusory sword sect swordsmen followed LV Ruochang's earlier warning and activated their sword radiance to resist the golden light. For now, they were not in danger, except for one person. That was the Quilted Mountain sect's Song Yuan. Song Yuan led his men into the Golden Destruction Formation. They were not at the front in the first place. The beast cultivators and bird cultivators formed a formation in the middle of the sword formations. When the swords were flying in the formation, the beast cultivators and bird cultivators could only barely defend against the flying swords with the combined attacks that they had practiced. This way, they were at a disadvantage compared to the swordsmen who formed the sword array. Before the bone-corroding golden light landed, many of their disciples had already died. Seeing this, Song Yuan immediately transformed into his huge ape avatar. He roared as he stepped in the air, trying his best to resist the flying swords. Song Yuan's huge ape avatar was truly impressive. It had already succeeded in the Soul Destruction Array. Within the Golden Destruction Array, facing the tidal wave of remnant swords, black light flickered around its body. Its arms danced, and it was like a 100-foot-tall wall blocking the swords. It was like a pillar protecting many beast cultivator disciples. However, when the bone-corroding golden light appeared, the golden light followed the sword and struck the huge ape's fur when the huge ape knocked the flying sword away. Sizzle! An intense sound was emitted from the point of contact between the black light and the golden light. Even the black aura that lingered around the fur started to surge under the golden light. As it surged, the black aura started to rapidly thin and fade. What made Song Yuan even more alarmed was that the black light was restrained and corroded by the golden light. A heart-wrenching, bone-piercing pain mixed with extreme itchiness emerged from his avatar. Roar! The great ape let out a furious roar. Both of its hands clenched into fists and rapidly pounded its chest. Its entire body abruptly moved in midair, causing the entire formation to tremble. Then, it charged towards the place where GMO and the others had just disappeared. Woo! The giant ape's fist carried the sound of wind as it smashed into the flying swords that were everywhere in the air. As the flying swords scattered, the golden light once again scattered. The black aura around the great ape evaporated, and the black light dissipated. Strands of bloody light gradually seeped out from under its fur. Swordsman Song Yuan. Chu Jiansheng was close to the great ape. At this moment, he and a few other grade 2 illusory swordsmen from the dazzling sword sect had formed a rhombus-shaped sword formation. Their sword auras formed a front as they tried their best to avoid the golden light. He was slightly stronger than Song Yuan. When the blood on Song Yuan's body was dripping, the golden light had just passed through their sword formation. Roar! The great ape waved its fist with all its might as if it could shatter the void. However, it couldn't drive the golden light away. This second roar was already filled with heart-wrenching pain. Pieces of its flesh were already beginning to fall apart. Song Yuan's huge body couldn't resist the golden light. Helpless, his body gradually shrank as he tried to dodge some of the golden light. However, this obviously wasn't a good plan. As the great ape shrank, its flesh had already begun to fall off. Not good. Not only was Song Yuan in danger, Chu Jiansheng and the others were also in danger. After the golden light penetrated the sword formation, it immediately scattered on their swords. Their cultivation was much weaker than LV Ruochang and the others. Therefore, they couldn't maintain their sword forms where the sword light flashed. Wang, a strong sword hum was emitted from the middle of the great sword. The great sword that LV Ruochang had transformed into let out a high-pitched hum once again. The vibrations that were similar to breathing rapidly surged. The entire sword began to shake, and a strong sword aura soared into the sky. This vibration was completely different from before. It couldn't resist the golden light. Under the golden light, The great sword's radiance was rapidly corroded, wong, wong. Following LV Ruochang's sword hum, more than 10 great swords also hummed at the same time. Similarly, they ignored the bone-corroding golden light and began to swell. They also emitted a strong sword aura that soared into the sky. Woo! The 100,000 swordsmen who were still struggling to maintain the great sword formation were also clamoring. The sword aura emitted by the 100,000 swordsmen on the great sword formation was even more powerful. It pierced straight into the sky above the formation. Hurry up and control the formation. Xiong Huasong, who was hidden in the formation, knew that the swordsmen were going to risk their lives. He hurriedly urged GMO. At this time, besides the disciples of the four sects, nearly half of the disciples from the other sects had come over to resist the swordsmen together. Although they weren't very familiar with the Golden Destruction formation, under the guidance of the disciples of the four sects, they quickly became competent. Hearing Xiong Huasong's urging, GMO and the other three hurriedly waved their small banners. The dermic powers of nearly 200,000 Dao sect disciples in the Golden Destruction formation were simultaneously mobilized. A strong suction force appeared on one side of the formation, sucking in the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, sword aura, and sword intent within dozens of miles. As a huge amount of spiritual energy of heaven and earth, sword aura, and other things poured into the formation, the entire formation began to shake. Even the small banners of GMO and the other three emitted a golden brilliance. An uncontrollable heaviness was emitted from the small banners. GMO and the other three's arms swayed slightly, and panic appeared on their faces. "Don't panic!" Xiong Huasong naturally knew that something was wrong. He hurriedly shouted, "Take your time to absorb the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, broken swords, and other things. The spiritual energy of heaven and earth is easy for us cultivators to control. Those broken swords, sword aura, and sword intent belong to the swordsmen for many years. They're definitely not easy to control. If you absorb too much, I'm afraid that the formation won't be able to withstand it. For now, don't absorb anymore. Activate the broken swords and other things first. Fight with the swordsmen and consume the sword intent. After another hour, the entire formation will close up. The dermic powers of the other 9 formations will be able to be freely transferred to the Golden Destruction formation, and we will be able to easily kill the swordsmen." Boom! Another earth-shattering sound rang out, and the entire formation shook intensely. Under the combined attack of the sword cultivators, the flying swords that poured in were almost destroyed. Damn it, the small banners in the hands of GMO and the others swayed slightly, and they almost fell out of their hands. They unconsciously gritted their teeth and cursed. Strengthen the attack. Kill them a few more times, and the bone-eroding golden light will be able to exterminate them. Seeing the powerful counterattack of the sword cultivators, Xiong Huasong was also furious. When GMO and the others heard this, they hurriedly waved the small banners again. A huge amount of metal element spiritual chi of heaven and earth poured in even more intensely, and the entire formation let out a slight rumbling sound again. Xiong Huasong raised his eyebrows, as if he wanted to warn GMO and asked them to stop absorbing the metal element spiritual chi of heaven and earth. However, nearly 100,000 swordsmen once again released sword aura, rushing straight into the air and colliding with the dozens of flying swords. They rushed towards the incoming flying swords like a tide. This time it was different. When the sword aura of Lu Ruochang and the others made contact with the flying swords, they immediately guarded an area and began to rotate. In addition, when the sword aura of the 100,000 swordsmen made contact with the rotating sword aura, it instantly retreated. This retreating force immediately produced a strong suction force and actually formed a huge whirlpool. The suction force was so great and so wide. It was like a giant hand was grabbing all the flying swords, but it was also like a net. It rapidly passed through these flying swords, rushed into the formation through the sword intent, and extended out of the formation. The swordsman's ability to control the metal element's spiritual chi of heaven and earth and sword intent was clearly far superior to the Dao sect swordsman. Wu, a suction force even stronger than when GMO and the others were controlling the formation, was produced from the formation. An even greater amount of heaven and earth spiritual chi of heaven and earth, as well as the broken swords and other objects, surged towards the formation. What are they doing? Are they going to throw themselves into a dead end? GMO didn't understand and muttered very strangely. Not good. Quick, 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 seal the formation. Xiong Huasong was the most familiar with the 10-direction annihilation formation. When he saw the entire golden annihilation formation tremble with the influx of metal element spiritual chi of heaven and earth, he already understood what the swordsmen were thinking. He hurriedly said, "These damned swordsmen are relying on the sword tomb's metal element spiritual chi of heaven and earth and the flying swords to break my golden annihilation formation." Wu, hundreds of thousands of swordsmen, 200,000 swordsmen. They were simultaneously extracting the metal element spiritual chi of heaven and earth from the sword tomb. At the same time, they were simultaneously extracting the metal element spiritual chi of heaven and earth from the sword tomb. The 10-direction annihilation formation immediately exceeded the limits of what it could withstand. The golden annihilation formation rumbled, and the surrounding restrictions instantly began to collapse. Seeing this, Xiong Huasong's expression became extremely ugly. He clapped his hands, and dozens of array flags appeared in his hands. He spat a mouthful of blood essence on them, and the array flags glowed with a 10-colored brilliance. Go! Xiong Huasong waved his hands, and a golden array flag flew into the air, flying towards the collapsing restrictions. However, before the array flag could fly one zhang away, Kacha, a sound like the sky being torn apart, resounded through the air. The golden annihilation formation's restrictions finally collapsed under the combined efforts of both sides. This golden annihilation formation was finally destroyed under LV Ruochang's scheme. Xiong Huasong swept his gaze across and saw that the swordsman's sword light had dimmed. He knew that they had expended a lot of energy for this scheme. He coldly snorted and ordered, "Fellow Taoist GMO, mobilize all the disciples and activate their magic power at the same time." Yes. GMO originally wanted to ask if they still needed to repair this golden annihilation formation, but the words stopped at the tip of his tongue. The small flag in his hand danced without hesitation. Chapter 2649. Xiong Huasong waved his hand, and all the formation flags flew out. He sneered, "Since you want the bone-corroding golden light, I'll give it to you all at once." As more than 10 array flags entered the formation, the golden annihilation formation collapsed even faster. However, the golden light became even stronger. Under the push of the 200,000 cultivators, the golden light poured onto the snow like sword light, like a torrential downpour. Charge! Lu Ruochang and the others were overjoyed. They knew that the golden destruction formation had indeed been broken, and this was their only chance to charge into the 10-direction annihilation formation. Even if the Dao sect cultivators summoned thousands of golden lights, they did not hesitate to send out their illusory swords. Dozens of giant swords flew at the front, followed by the giant swords formed by 100,000 swordsmen. The remaining half of the beast cultivators and bird cultivators flew at the back and rushed into the golden light together. Whoosh! It was definitely boiling water falling on snow. The moment the bone-corroding golden light came into contact with the sword light, it became even stronger than before. More than half of the sword light was instantly destroyed. All the illusory swordsmen who had transformed into swords could no longer maintain their sword forms and gradually revealed their true forms. As for the swordsmen who were lucky enough to survive, they wailed and died in a bloody mess in front of the golden destruction formation's restriction. Rumble, with the sound of the earth collapsing, as tens of thousands of swordsmen escaped the Golden Destruction Formation finally collapsed completely. The 10-colored light screen in the air was also torn apart, and the light spot in the center reappeared. After the light spot flashed 9 times, it turned into 9 meteors and fell separately. Where the meteors fell, the sky was torn apart, revealing the rainy night sky outside the formation. Drops of rain fell and hit the formation. The 9 meteors landed on the 9 greater rays. At this time, the 9 greater rays slowly stopped moving. When the meteors completely landed, the brilliance of the 9 rays disappeared, revealing the original appearance of the sword tomb. Fellow Taoist Xiong. In the heavy rain, Hung Zhao's body flashed with a protective golden light. He hurriedly shouted, "This formation has been broken by the sword cultivators?" Xiong Huasong's face was filled with surprise. He pointed at the sword cultivators whose backs could still be seen and said, "That's right, the 10-direction annihilation formation of the Black Heaven sect has finally been broken. I really didn't expect that there would be sword cultivators who are proficient in Dao sect formations. The strongest part of a formation is often the most vulnerable part of the formation. Although I've heard of this in the past, I've never dared to try it. I didn't expect to encounter it today. To be honest, I didn't even notice this part when I set up the formation. I was only thinking of how to hide the formation's formation. I never noticed this layer." When Hung Feng heard Xiong Huasong's explanation, his face was also filled with shock. Although he did not know much about spirit arrays, he understood the principles of spirit arrays. He could not help but exclaim, "In that case, this idea of breaking the spirit array was thought of by a sword cultivator? That's impossible, in this old man's opinion. I'm afraid that they were just blind cats running into dead mice, right? How is that possible?" Xiong Huasong shook his head decisively. "If these sword cultivators charge into the water destruction formation under LV Ruochang's lead and find this flaw within the formation, then I can still agree with fellow Taoist Hung Ming's thoughts." However, LV Ruochang suddenly turned to the Golden Destruction Formation before entering the Water Destruction Formation. She must have thought of something. "Fellow Taoist Hung Ming, don't forget that LV Ruochang escaped from the Golden Destruction Formation." She stared at the formation for a long time in the center of the formation. She must have been thinking. However, Xiong Huasong said proudly, "So what if LV Ruochang could see the flaw? I'm already very satisfied to be able to kill nearly half of the sword cultivators. After all, this formation is incomplete, and I was ordered to set it up in a hurry." Hung nodded slightly. He knew very well that it had only been a short time since he had discussed the formation with Xiong Huasong in the meeting hall of the Sky Patrol City. At that time, all the Gold Core cultivators did not pay much attention to it. He did not expect that it would come in handy today. Just now, Hung Ming saw that Xiong Huasong added fuel to the fire. He used the collapse of the Golden Destruction Formation to increase the bone-corroding golden light. Not only did he kill Song Yuan, a third-grade illusory sword beast cultivator, but he also killed several second-grade and first-grade illusory swordsmen. Most of the beast cultivators and bird cultivators couldn't escape from the final blow. The number of sword cultivators who could escape from the Golden Destruction Formation was definitely not more than 70,000. Although this was a little different from what he had imagined, and they were not completely annihilated, it was still a great victory. Xiong Huasong could be proud. The rain poured down like a torrential downpour. This rain was only light before the battle, but as the 10-direction annihilation formation absorbed the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, the sword tomb's astronomical phenomenon was also triggered. The endless dark clouds and torrential rain began to wreak havoc in the sword tomb. Of course, such a torrential rain was nothing to the cultivators, especially in a special place like the sword tomb. There was no heavenly lightning, so it didn't affect the cultivators flying high. Hung Ming's body flashed with a protective brilliance, avoiding the torrential rain. He looked into the distance and asked softly, "Fellow Xiong, according to your opinion, should we continue to chase?" "Oh." Xiong Huasong was slightly taken aback. He glanced at Hung Zhao and asked with interest, Why don't you chase after them? Now that our cultivators have one, it's the best time to chase after them. Of course, fellow Hung Ming is the commander of this battle. We will listen to your arrangements. Hung Ming was not surprised by Xiong Huasong's answer. He hesitated slightly and said, "Actually, with the help of fellow Xiong's formation, our Dao sect has already won. The remaining 70,000 swordsmen are nothing. As the saying goes, don't chase after a cornered enemy. If they are forced into a corner, they may bite back and cause us cultivators to suffer some losses." Yes, fellow Hung Ming's words are reasonable. Xiong Huasong nodded. Moreover, LV Ruochang and the others activated the gold-type heaven and earth spirit chi. In addition, I somewhat risked it all by activating the bone-corroding golden light. Not only did the disciples of the four sects, who were originally guarding this formation, suffer from the backlash of the formation, but our disciples were also affected. There were many casualties. Hung Ming sighed slightly. In fact, if Xiong Huasong had not activated the golden light, these disciples might not have suffered any casualties. However, because of Xiong Huasong's greed for merit, he killed 1,000 enemies but lost 800 of his own men. Seeing that the traces of the sword cultivators in the distance were almost gone, Hung Ming narrowed his eyes and nodded. "Fellow Xiong, you should stop exploring the area in the sword tomb, right? We don't know where the sword cultivators went. Perhaps there are many remnant sword formations and formations. In that case, we will withdraw our troops. We can also report to the nascent soul stage masters with such great merit." Xiong Huasong raised his eyebrows. He did not expect Hung Ming to make such a decision. However, he only smiled and said, "Although the remaining swordsmen are third-grade illusory swordsmen, they have been seriously injured by the bone-corroding golden light. This is the best time to kill them. However, if fellow Hung Ming thinks that there is no need to chase, then there is no need to chase. I will give the order on behalf of fellow Taoist." Hesitation. Overcautious. That was Hung Ming's current mood. He really wanted to stop while he was ahead. However, after hearing Xiong Huasong's words, his heart was moved. After all, killing a third-grade illusory swordsman was completely different from killing tens of thousands of bright swords. Even his own disciple could kill Qin Jian, who was a third-grade illusory swordsman. He couldn't kill a few to make a name for himself. Just as Hung Ming was hesitating, LV Ruochang and the others, who were fleeing in panic, were also extremely depressed. This was an incomparable feeling of regret. It was originally a great battle, but now they were defeated. More than half of the hundreds of thousands of swordsmen were killed. If those second-grade illusory swordsmen who died in the 10-direction annihilation array were to really fight with the Dao sect cultivators, they might not have died, especially Tsang Yuan of the Quilted Mountain sect. He was a third-grade illusory swordsman and could not even be defeated by a golden core cultivator in the conference hall. However, he was killed by the bone-corroding golden light in this golden annihilation array. Thinking of that irresistible bone-corroding golden light, LV Ruochang clenched her teeth, and her heart was filled with resentment. She really wanted to die for Tsang Yuan. Qianmo. At this moment, LV Ruochang could not help but think of the leader of the Imperial Thunder sect who self-destructed in front of her. He was a mid-stage golden core cultivator who could have escaped with his life. LV Ruochang did not understand what Qianmo said that day. However, every word, every tear, every sentence, every word seemed to be engraved in her heart, as if they were specially said for her today. I would rather self-destruct. LV Ruochang even groaned softly. I'm not willing to return to the sword domain. It was an absolute humiliation. Junior sister LV Ruoling was flying not far from LV Ruochang. This attentive third-grade illusory swordswoman was extremely sensitive to LV Ruochang's murmur. Although she did not know what LV Ruochang was talking about, she still said, "We have to be alert to prevent the Dao sect cultivators from chasing after us." See, at this point, an indescribable pain came from her body. Even a powerful illusory swordswoman like Ruo Ling could not help but cry out softly. The bone-corroding golden light was really amazing. The swords of the surviving illusory swordsmen had long been pierced by the golden light, and much of their flesh and blood had been lost. However, this kind of injury, Ruo Ling and the others had not experienced it for many years. The flashing sword lights around them blocked the rain, but what they could not block was the unhealed pain in their bodies. Chasing after us? LV Ruochang smiled bitterly, but her divine will still involuntarily swept back. Her divine will could not go very far, so she turned her head back to look. However, when she looked back, she could not help but groan softly. Ouch! Her injury was only deeper than Ruo Ling's. Moreover, when she was in the center of the 10-direction annihilation formation, although she looked calm and indifferent as she described the bone-corroding golden light, she had not fully recovered from the injuries she had suffered in the 10-direction annihilation formation. When the golden light brushed past her for the second time, although she had the protection of the sword heart mystic skill, when the golden light attacked her from both inside and outside, her body showed signs of collapsing. Chapter 2650. LV Ruochang knew that if another golden core cultivator tried to stop her, she would not even be able to transform into a sword. Behind the tens of thousands of sword cultivators, under the pitch-black night sky, the drizzle that seemed to connect heaven and earth emitted a strange white color. From time to time, there would be wails and explosions, but there was no trace of the Dao sect cultivators chasing after them. LV Ruochang knew that this was the most realistic situation, but she still felt that she was lucky. However, this luck was strangled by her as soon as it was born. She said, "Senior Sister Ruoling, the Dao sect cultivators have won a great victory and killed us to such a miserable state. They have some brains. They will definitely not chase after us." Ruoling naturally knew that the cultivators would not chase after them. She just wanted to comfort LV Ruochang. She smiled and said, "Who knows? In this great battle of sword cultivators, the Golden Core cultivators in the meeting hall of Sky Patrol City have done many ridiculous things and killed many cultivators. Even if they chase after us, even if it is really the skull of a Jurassic beast, I will still believe it." Ha ha! LV Ruochang's heart warmed, and she could not help but laugh. Her smile was extremely beautiful, like the blossoming of a crystal-clear ice sculpture on an iceberg. LV Jianyu. The cultivators really caught up. Zhu Qingye, who was dozens of feet away from them, did not want to participate in the conversation between the two female swordsmen. He had complaints about LV Ruochang in his heart, but when he involuntarily looked back, he could not help but shout in shock. How is this possible? LV Ruochang really did not dare to believe it, but she could not help but look back. When she saw that the night sky, which was still pitch black just now, was now flashing with the brilliance of some Dharma treasures, an absolutely unbelievable feeling surged in her heart. This is really unbelievable. LV Ruochang could not express it in words. Were the Dao sect cultivators that stupid? Were they that greedy for credit? Was he really so vicious and merciless? Could the Dao sect cultivators be blamed? Just as Hung Ming was hesitating, Ji Hongfei from the Clear Leaf sect came over and looked at the two people standing in the air with a frown. She said anxiously, "Daoist Hung Ming, the sword cultivators have already escaped from the 10-direction annihilation formation. Why are you still standing here?" At this point, he seemed to have realized something and said to Xiong Huasong in surprise, "Could it be that fellow Daoist Xiong still has a backup plan?" Backup plan? Xiong Huasong used all of his means. Xiong Huasong said with a bitter smile, "This Xiong Grand Array was defeated by LV Ruochang. Then what are you waiting for?" Ji Hong said angrily, "Right now, the sword cultivators are like birds startled by the twang of a bow. We're going to march north and kill them all. This isn't appropriate, right?" Hung Ju's eyes narrowed, and he said with a smile, "Don't chase a cornered enemy. This is a principle that hasn't changed since ancient times. Furthermore, we are in the depths of the sword catacomb, which is not our forte. If we kill a few more sword cultivators, our Dao sect cultivators will also suffer more losses. It's not worth it." Humph, If you won't chase, then I will. I don't care about other people's lives, but today I must take that slut Lu Ruochang's head." Ji Hong was enraged. She shouted, "You didn't see Dao friend Qian Mo's death. He was forced to his death by LV Ruochang. In order for us to escape safely, he was willing to self-destruct. I have already thought it through. I must kill LV Ruochang in this life to avenge Dao friend Qian Mo." Today, LV Ruochang was heavily injured in the Golden Destruction Array. As long as I see her, I will immediately kill her. Good. Hung Ju had long been waiting for Ji Hong's words. He clapped his hands and said, "Since Dao friend Ji has such ambition, and we have such a blood feud with the swordsman, how can I not allow it? Then, for Dao friend Qian Mo's death, for the hundreds of thousands of fallen disciples, I will give the order. Other than the injured disciples, the rest of the disciples will listen to my command and head to the depths of the sword catacomb to kill the swordsman. We must kill them all. Yes, we must take LV Ruochang's head as a sacrifice to Dao friend Qian Mo." Ji Hong shouted. Xiong Huasong frowned slightly and said softly, "LV Ruochang is the leader of the sword cultivators. I'm afraid it won't be easy to kill her." "Dao friend Xiong, are you afraid? Do you want the hundreds of thousands of fallen Dao sect disciples to die in vain?" Ji Hong said coldly, "If you don't go, we won't bicker with you. You set up this array and have already made a great contribution. Naturally, you don't have to follow us." "Ha ha! Am I the kind of person who is afraid of death?" Xiong Huasong laughed loudly. "Go, go, go. We will chase after them and kill LV Ruochang." Ji Hong's brows relaxed. She waved her hand and said, "Clear Leaf Sect disciples, follow me to chase after the swordsman." Yes, at this moment, only a small portion of the Clear Leaf Sect disciples suffered from the backlash of the Golden Destruction Array and were recuperating. The majority of the disciples were in high morale. When they heard Ji Hong's words, they all responded. Hung Ju wasn't the slightest bit annoyed that Ji Hong had stolen the limelight. Instead, he looked at Xiong Huasong and said, "Dao friend Xiong, you are in charge of this 10-direction annihilation array. Give the order to attack on behalf of I." "Yes, Dao friend Hung Ming." Xiong Huasong didn't hesitate. Although he didn't explicitly say that they could chase after the swordsman, he didn't think much of it. The swordsman had already been killed by the array. How could they still have a chance to turn the tables? After he gave the order, many Dao sect cultivators immediately got into formation. Before long, they chased after LV Ruochang and the others. Just as Hung Ju was about to fly up, Tai Ching sect's Sun hurriedly flew over and said loudly, "Dao friend Hung Ming, don't chase after a cornered enemy." Xiong Huasong glanced at him and ignored him. He activated his flying technique and flew towards the disciples who were in formation. Hung Ju looked at the anxious Sun and helplessly recounted what Ji Hong had said. He smiled bitterly and said, "I was also forced onto this path. If I don't chase after them, wouldn't I be letting down Dao friend Qian Mo? Moreover, the Clear Leaf Sect disciples are also in danger. I can only chase after them." Sigh. "But if you chase after them, it's also dangerous." The Sun smiled bitterly as well. He was just short of scolding Ji Hong for having long hair and short knowledge. "We have to weigh the two and choose the lesser," Hung Ju said in a low voice. "Even if the swordsmen want to retaliate, they only have about 70,000 disciples. We can drown them with our saliva. Forget it. We were also forced onto the pirate ship." The Sun looked at Hung Ju and said with a double meaning, "For Qian Mo's death from the Imperial Thunder Sect. Yes, sometimes there are some things that we have no choice but to do." Hung Ju nodded. In I's opinion, even if a nascent soul master was here, he would also make such a decision. That's right. The Sun didn't say much. He hurriedly turned around and urged the disciples to chase after the swordsman. Chapter 26:51. How? How is this possible? LV Ruochang, who was in the distance, was in disbelief. She was so grateful that she almost wanted to kneel on the ground. If she knew that Ji Hong was the one behind this, She might even cut off a chicken's head and burn yellow paper to become sworn sisters with Ji Hong. Quick, we will slow down immediately. LV Ruochang was just about to give the order, but her gaze fell on the panicked swordsmen. These swordsmen were completely like, oh no, it was like they were defeated. Why was there a need to pretend? Why bother slowing down? LV Ruochang looked up at the night sky in front of her. She clapped her hands and took out a flying sword. She activated the sword Origin, and the flying sword shot into the distance like a ray of light. In less than half a meal's worth of time, another flying sword flew back. LV Ruochang received the flying sword and inspected it. A smile appeared at the corner of her mouth, while traces of coldness flashed in her eyes. When she turned her head to look at the gradually approaching brilliance of the Dharma treasure in the distance, and then looked at Zhu Qingye and Ruo Ling who were close by, she did not say anything. She only stretched out her right index finger, which swayed left and right in the air. It was spotlessly white and flawless, emitting a faint sword light in the night. Almost 70,000 swordsmen panicked when they saw the cultivators chasing after them. Naturally, there was no lack of intelligent people. They immediately thought of the sword slip that LV Ruochang had used before they were trapped in the formation. They thought of the four-direction sword formation that LV Ruochang had mentioned earlier and were immediately energized, regardless of whether they knew what was going on or not. All the swordsmen fled in the direction of the four-direction sword formation that LV Ruochang had painstakingly set up over the years. The hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators behind did not expect that the already dead poisonous snake would raise its head and give them a fatal blow. The battle between Dao cultivators should have ended naturally at this point. However, due to a freak combination of factors and the unpredictability of a person's heart, there was an earth-shattering change. Anyone who could watch from a high position would definitely sigh at the fickleness of the world. But who would watch from a high position? Even Xiao Hua, who was high up, did not have the ability to observe the battle from a single glance. At this moment, Xiao Hua was trapped in the maze of the four directions sword formation in midair. He sat cross-legged with a frown on his face and a bitter smile on his face. Alas, this matter is truly beyond this young master's expectations. Xiao Hua sighed. The metal escape technique is far more complicated than this young master had imagined. It was actually divided into low, middle, and high grades. The low grade could travel within the metal equipment, the middle grade could travel with the help of the metal energy, and the high grade could travel with the help of the metal energy in places where the metal energy was extinguished. This young master is truly ignorant and inexperienced, simply a frog in a well. In the past, this young master had cultivated the earth escape, fire escape, and wood escape. This young master felt that this young master was free wherever he went. But now, it seems that these three escape techniques are only low-level techniques. If I truly want to be free and unfettered within the five elements, I must cultivate the five elements escape techniques to the extreme. Alas, now I know. Where did the path of cultivation come from? As long as there was a passageway, it would be good enough. How many capable people in this world are there? Although they have extraordinary aptitudes, they do not have the opportunity to cultivate. What can they do in their lifetime? Xiao Hua sighed with emotion. Now that this young master has obtained the metal escape technique, I have already obtained 4 of the 5 elements escape techniques. If I can find the water escape technique, I will be able to complete it. Won't I be 100 times stronger than them? Let's see. It's not just the water escape technique. Even the metal escape technique, the wood escape technique, and the fire escape technique need to be of a higher grade. The 5 elements escape techniques are not easy to gather. But the wind escape technique, with perhaps in the future, I will have the opportunity to obtain an even higher grade technique from the Empress. As for the truly complete escape technique, it is still my Imperial Thunder Sect's Thunder Escape Technique. Thinking of this, Xiao Hua smiled again. This young master's Thunder Escape Technique feels like it has reached a kind of extreme. If I cultivate a little more, I should be able to catch up with the Imperial Thunder Sect's Sect Master. Don't tell me this young master has the potential to run away. Actually, this wasn't the first time Xiao Hua had this thought. The thunder escape technique was an extremely difficult technique to cultivate in the Imperial Thunder sect, and was even harder to cultivate than Foundation Establishment, Golden Core, and Nascent Soul techniques. But in Xiao Hua's hands, this thunder escape technique was simply tailor-made for him. He didn't need to work too hard. As long as he progressed step by step, he could easily advance. If this were to get out, it would really be stupefying. It was precisely because of this that when Xiao Hua disguised himself as Wu Ming from the Imperial Thunder sect and used Thunder Escape technique, no one would associate this Wu Ming with Xiao Hua, who was at the Middle Foundation establishment stage. At that moment, Xiao Hua's heart stirred again, and his mind entered the space. That wisp of primordial spirit that was using the sword escape technique seemed to have comprehended something. "Mother!" Goldie sensed Xiao Hua entering the space, and called out very gently. Xiao Hua replied, then looked at little Silver, who was jumping between the spirit grasses. This guy still had half a spirit grass left in his mouth, and the emerald juice stained his lips green. Seeming to sense Goldie's respect, little Silver also hurriedly stopped on a spirit grass. It was just that the spirit grass was too thin for little Silver's small body to support it. With a plop, little Silver fell to the ground, then flipped over and climbed to his feet. His tiny tail flicked nimbly over his body, and some of the dust on it was shaken off. Hee. Xiao Hua smiled slightly. Looking at the space that hadn't changed much, he paused in midair and carefully comprehended what that wisp of primordial spirit had gained. This primordial spirit sword controlling technique is indeed correct. After all, tempering the primordial spirit can strengthen it to the point where it can control spells and magic treasures in the space. After a long while, Xiao Hua already understood that this sword escape technique was fundamentally a technique to strengthen the primordial spirit. Only when the primordial spirit was stronger than that of an ordinary swordsman would they have the strength to control a flying sword. Of course, Xiao Hua had already obtained Li Xiubai's primordial spirit strengthening technique before. It was just that the previous primordial spirit strengthening technique was to nurture the primordial spirit from an infant to a child, while the secret technique was to nurture the child to adulthood and even teach the adult how to wield a spear. Primordial spirit strengthening technique? Xiao Hua suddenly quivered, and a question that he hadn't thought about carefully before appeared in his mind. This young master's primordial spirits are now 10. Although they are all weak, they each have their own affairs and responsibilities, and everything is in order. It's just that if all 10 primordial spirits grow up and become stronger in the future, who will be the master and who will be the assistant? Don't tell me. Xiao Hua will be divided into 10 parts? Thinking this, Xiao Hua felt himself break out in a cold sweat. Naturally, his mind was now in the space, so how could there be cold sweat? There must be a primordial spirit to strengthen, and this primordial spirit must be far stronger than the other primordial spirits. Xiao Hua immediately made a decision, but then he was in a dilemma. Which primordial spirit needs to be strengthened? The one to comprehend the heavenly Tao? The one to comprehend the hand of karma? Or, for a moment, Xiao Hua was extremely hesitant, not knowing how to choose. But just as Xiao Hua was about to think carefully, a sense of vigilance came from outside. Damn it, this bastard Yutong really wants to kill me. This young master's metal escape technique is just a beginner. How can I use it to run away? Xiao Hua immediately understood that this was Yu Tong attacking him outside of the capital star array and the innate true water. He didn't have time to think too much, and his mind immediately left the space, leaving the primordial spirit to continue practicing the primordial spirit strengthening technique. Xiao Hua opened his eyes and saw the incomplete capital heavenly star array protecting him. Outside of the capital heavenly star array, the azure innate true water rippled and flowed silently. Countless tiny bubbles floated in the water in an indescribable trajectory. It was as if each bubble was a complete dimension, and each dimension contained a tragic story. Although the innate true water was created by Xiao Hua, he didn't dare to look at it too much, for fear that he would lose his mind if he wasn't careful. Boom! A drum-like sound came from outside the innate true water. Although the sound was extremely weak, Xiao Huan knew that it was the loud sound of Yutong activating the Buddhist golden array. Did this bastard think of a way to break the array? Xiao Huan was slightly surprised. After waiting for a while, he didn't see any strange movements from the innate true water. He couldn't help but activate the Buddha Saraira, and a small crack appeared in the innate true water. Through the crack, Xiao Hua could clearly see that outside the room was still flickering with silver light, and Yutong was nowhere to be seen. Boom! Another loud sound rang out, and it was as if the entire space was shaking. Xiao Hua's heart skipped a beat, and an extremely bad feeling emerged from his heart. Forget it, let's run first. Xiao Hua's eyes turned, and he silently grabbed with his hand, and the dozens of talismans flew into the space. Then he activated the Buddha Saraira and used the clear water bottle to store the innate true water. He looked around, and then flew in a certain direction. When he reached the silver wall, he closed his eyes and started chanting. It's just that if Xiao Hua's incantation was heard by other people, perhaps they would lose their big teeth again. But they heard him recite, "May the deities and Buddhas all over the sky bless this kid." This is the first time this kid has used the metal evasion technique. Don't disappoint this kid. Any immortal who passes by, please open your eyes. This young master is a disciple of the Imperial Lightning Sect, and this young master is about to use it. After these few sentences, the real mantra began. When Xiao Hua formed the mantra, his body flashed with a faint silver light, and Xiao Hua slammed into the silver wall. Dong! The sound traveled far, but Xiao Hua didn't enter the wall. Instead, he frowned and touched his forehead. The force of this collision was too strong. Fortunately, Xiao Hua's skin was rough, and his flesh was far thicker than an ordinary person's. A small dent appeared on the wall, and Xiao Hua's head didn't have a bump. After thinking for a moment, Xiao Hua tried again, but to his surprise, this metal escape technique was indeed somewhat interesting. Of course, it could also be that Xiao Hua was too impatient and didn't completely comprehend it. Xiao Hua actually slammed into the wall more than 10 times, but he still couldn't enter it. Chapter 2652. Fortunately, Xiao Hua was the only cultivator in the maze of the Buddhist Gold Great Array. If it was seen by others, wouldn't Xiao Hua be regarded as a madman? If Xiao Hua was like a madman, then in the huge square inside the Buddhist Gold Great Array, Yutong, wearing a silver robe and disheveled hair, was really a madman. However, there was no trace of people on the square at this time. It seemed that all the disciples of the fallen gold mountain had been sent back to the family by Yutong. However, even so, the layout of the square still had some changes. The passages had long disappeared, and the whole square was seamless. It was not much different from the small grid of Xiao Hua's previous. In front of Yutong were 2 sword gourds. However, at this time, the silver light cocoons on the 2 sword gourds had disappeared. Even the scarlet, red, and azure colors were tightly attached to the surface of the sword gourds, not far away. However, what was different from before was that these 2 sword gourds were slowly rotating in a circle in the air. One was chasing the other, while the other was chasing the one in front. It was as if there was an endless attraction and repulsion between the 2 sword gourds. Yutong was not idle either. Above his head, the silver tiger dharma body had already appeared. It had a pair of fleshy wings, and its fist-sized eyes flashed with a silver-white brilliance as it stared fixedly at the 2 sword gourds that were constantly changing. These 2 sword gourds had been rotating like this for a day and night, but there was no change in the speed and trajectory. Yutong's feet were using a mysterious footwork, and his body was flashing with a silver brilliance. The brilliance changed slightly with his footwork, like the swaying seaweed in the sea. At the same time, the true essence around Yutong's body surged, and some strange spells were launched. However, the strange thing was that these spells did not fall on the 2 sword gourds, but on the trajectory of the sword gourds. As the spell was inserted, layers of silver light appeared on the path. This light was absorbed by the sword gourd from time to time, but this silver light wasn't absorbed by the sword gourd. It only landed on the surface of the sword gourd and condensed with the red and azure lights. Gradually, the red and azure lights on the sword gourd faded. Roar, seeing that the color on the two sword gourds had faded. The silver tiger above Yu Tong's head roared angrily. It spread its wings and pounced toward the two sword gourds. It opened its mouth and spat out a silver-white breath onto the two sword gourds. Buzz, the two sword gourds let out an ear-piercing sword hum at the same time. The sword hum was even louder than the giant swords that Lu Ruochong and the others had transformed into. In an instant, Yu Tong and the silver tiger were sent flying more than 30 meters away. Yu Tong seemed to be prepared. As soon as his figure flew out, he immediately flew back. There was a slight joy on his face, but his eyes were still extremely calm, as if this was how it should be. When Yu Tong's figure appeared in front of the sword gourd again, the sword gourd was no longer as quiet as before. After the sword hum, it began to surge rapidly, and the entire sword gourd began to fluctuate. Quick, the joy on Yu Tong's face disappeared and was replaced by a trace of seriousness. The spell in his hands changed again. Both hands were using the same spell, and they hit the two sword gourds at the same time. Buzz, buzz, buzz. A low sword hum like a bee came from the two sword gourds at the same time, and the changes in the two sword gourds gradually disappeared. Then they began to vibrate. The rhythm was different at first, but it gradually became the same. Pooh! Seeing that the rhythm of the two sword gourds was the same, at that moment, Yu Tong opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of essence blood, which landed on the two sword gourds. The essence blood touched the sword gourds and immediately sank into them, disappearing without a trace. Yu Tong's body emitted a bright silver light again, and his scattered hair flew straight up. Quick! The spell that Yu Tong had been using for a long time immediately landed on the two sword gourds. Buzz, the two sword gourds let out a high-pitched sword hum at the same time. In fact, the crimson and azure light that had long faded bloomed again. However, at this time, the crimson and azure light only occupied half of the brilliance, and the other half was silver-white brilliance. Yu Tong's figure naturally retreated a few meters, but before he could stabilize himself, Yu Tong stretched out his hands. The silver-white brilliance on his hands covered the sword gourds. Then, as Yu Tong slowly closed his hands, the silver-white brilliance on the two sword gourds also slowly approached. Buzz, buzz, as if resisting this approach, the two sword gourds let out a sword hum. Roar! In just a moment, the brilliance around Yu Tong's body dimmed, and sweat faintly appeared on his forehead. Almost without thinking, his true tiger dharma flapped its wings, and several silver-white brilliance hit the sword gourds, and the two sword gourds moved a little more. Pu-pu-pu. The two sword gourds seemed to be extremely repelled. Yu Tong's true tiger dharma had no choice but to open its mouth again and spit out several silver-white breaths in a row, trying to put the two sword gourds together. However, there was just a small gap, and the sword gourds couldn't touch each other. Roar! Yu Tong's body was already trembling slightly. The true tiger dharma body let out another roar and spat out a breath of air that was much dimmer than before. The two sword calabashes moved slightly, but there was no effect. At this time, Yu Tong was a little hesitant, and his brows were tightly furrowed, as if he was thinking about something. But in the blink of an eye, the scarlet and azure brilliance on the two sword gourds swelled slightly, and a great force was generated, and the gap that was thinner than a strand of hair actually widened a little. Not good, seeing that his previous efforts were about to be wasted. Yu Tong gritted his teeth, and the silver-white brilliance on his body disappeared, and then a dark green color gradually appeared. A strange sound came from Yu Tong's mouth, and 9 balls of light that were extremely similar to the green seal script emerged from his forehead and quickly circled the two sword gourds a few times, and then completely disappeared into the sword gourds. The sword gourds' brilliance didn't resist the green light at all. Combined, Yu Tong said with great difficulty. The two sword gourds collided, and a surge of sword brilliance rushed out from the point of contact, directly piercing into the silver-white canopy of the Brahma gold formation. Yutong seemed to have used up all of his magic power, and his silver-white, Taoist robes were soaked in sweat. The true tiger's avatar couldn't hold on any longer, and with a howl, it fell into Yutong's body. The sword brilliance split open a huge crack in the silver-white canopy, and then disappeared. The scarlet and azure brilliance of the sword gourds quickly overflowed, and between the two colors was an extremely large amount of silver-white and a few strands of dark green. Of course, the few strands of gold under the dark green weren't very clear, or perhaps the exhausted Yutong couldn't see it at all. The scarlet and azure brilliance fluctuated for a long time and gradually settled down like the liquid of a pill. Between the scarlet and azure brilliance was a silver-white brilliance, and at this time, the dark green had disappeared without a trace. "AI," Yutong sighed, and used his hand to wipe away the sweat on his forehead. He softly muttered to himself, "Although this Yutong has the silver tiger bloodline, and his body is naturally stronger than ordinary cultivators, but it can't be considered useful. I still have to refine it more in the future. Unfortunately, this little lord's secret technique can only be used once. It seems this little lord won't be able to cultivate the embryonic form of the spirit-slaying origin light today." With that, Yutong reached out his hand and took out a spirit pill. He put it in his mouth and sat down cross-legged. Silver light flashed around his body as he began to adjust his breathing. The two sword gourds in front of Yutong were connected together. The two lights intertwined and spun, overflowing with each other as if they had already fused together. After an hour, Yutong's body flashed, and he stood up. He waved his hand as if he was going to put away the two sword gourds. However, when Yutong stretched out his hand, he looked a little unwilling. He bit his lips slightly and made a hand seal. His hand shook, and a silver brilliance hit the place where the sword gourd intersected. This time, the sword hummed even more, but the scarlet and azure lights trembled even more. After the light faded, the two sword gourds fused even more. Yutong almost couldn't believe his eyes. A trace of astonishment flashed in his eyes, and then he became even more ecstatic. How is this possible? The fusing of the yin-yang sword gourds, the further it goes, the more difficult it is. Yours truly secret technique was originally meant to be used here, but who would have thought that the power of this sword gourd would be so great? Even the initial fusion had to expend all of yours truly's powers, and it even required yours truly to use his secret technique. How could the subsequent fusion, which was even more difficult, be so simple? It's really incredible, really incredible. Yutong, of course, didn't dare to let his guard down. He hit a few spells on the sword gourds, and then used his divine thoughts to observe for a long time. He even released the Real Tiger, but in the end, he still didn't find anything strange. As expected, the heavens are helping me. I'm afraid my luck in this life is going to defy the heavens. Yutong beamed from ear to ear. In merely a few dozen days, the heavens have already allowed this young master to successfully possess this body, and even allowed this young master to obtain the position of sect master from the Fallen Gold Mountains Jade Slip. Now, this young master has been pleasantly surprised, allowing this young master to successfully refine the embryonic form of the soul-punishing vital light. After that, if I have the opportunity to refine the true soul-punishing vital light, then in the entire so-called Dawn Rain continent, who would be my opponent? Ha ha ha, my future is limitless. Ha ha ha. Yutong laughed wildly. He didn't stop walking, and his hand seals were formed again. This time, the hand seals were even more mysterious, and the steps were also different from before. However, as the hand seals were formed, the two sword gourds began to fuse slowly, and the light became even brighter and more condensed. Seeing that the two sword gourds had finally merged into one, Yutong chanted a mantra, raised his hands, and pressed them down. Chapter 2653. A A silver-white halo followed Yutong's hands and fell on the sword gourd. The halo spun rapidly on the sword gourd and swept down from top to bottom. As the halo fell, the sword gourd began to emit a sword cry and tremble slightly. The crimson and azure brilliance quickly shrank and condensed into the sword gourd, turning the sword gourd into a silver-white gourd. Ha! Yutong saw the sword gourd turn silver-white and laughed loudly. He pointed at the mouth of the sword gourd, and two sword lights, one azure and one red, rushed out from the sword gourd and pierced into the silver-white sky. Two bull-sized holes immediately appeared in the sky. Motherfucker, this spirit-slaying Yuan light is really powerful. Although it hasn't fully formed yet, it's still very powerful. Even though it's not fully formed, this Buddhist gold great array can't block it. Yutong clicked his tongue a few times, and a cold light flashed in his eyes. He looked at Xiao Hua's direction and said, "If the Buddhist gold great array can't block it, then the incomplete capital heavenly stars great array and the innate primordial water, I'm afraid they can't block it either. Feng Ying. Today, this young master will kill you. This young master wants to see who you are." Thinking about it, Yutong stretched out his hand, and the silver-white gourd appeared in his hand. His body slowly rose up, and a silver-white light flashed in the air, and Yutong disappeared. It was the metal escape technique that Xiao Hua had painstakingly practiced. Dong, dong, dong. The monotonous yet rhythmic sound reverberated in the maze of the Buddhist gold formation. It sounded like a drum or a gong. Yutong's figure appeared from the wall, not far away. He looked at Xiao Hua with a strange expression. From time to time, Xiao Hua's body would glow with a silvery white light, and he would rush to the wall from time to time. As Yutong appeared, Xiao Hua was extremely sensitive and sensed it. He quickly turned around and saw Yutong's thoughtful eyes. Xiao Hua's face turned slightly red. He raised his hand, and dozens of talismans immediately appeared. He wanted to set up the capital Heavenly Stars Great Array. Seeing the familiar silver light on Xiao Hua's body, Yutong seemed to have thought of something, and a mocking expression appeared in his eyes. When he saw Xiao Hua hurriedly setting up the formation, he didn't chase after him. Instead, he calmly watched and waited for Xiao Hua to release the Xiantian primordial water. Then, he coldly smiled and said, "Junior Martial Brother Feng Ying is indeed in a good mood. You're practicing the iron head technique. You're extremely diligent. I really admire you." Do I need you to tell me? Do I need to inform you? Xiao Hua was a little embarrassed, but he didn't say anything. Junior Brother Feng, you seem to have forgotten Yutong was in an extremely good mood. He smiled and said, "This is my Buddhist gold array, and it's also my home. Don't you need to inform the master if you do something inexplicable?" Xiao Hua looked at Yutong's smile, puzzled. His eyes fell on the silver gourd in Yutong's left hand, and his face immediately showed a look of understanding. I'm leaving. As the master, don't you want to open the door?" Xiao Hua bit his lip and said with narrowed eyes, "Leave? Feel free to leave." Yutong said with a smile, "This you has never forced people to stay. Could it be you weren't practicing the iron head technique just now? You were knocking on the door with your head? Your Buddhist gold great array doesn't even have a door. Don't need to knock on the door with my head?" Xiao Hua knew that Yutong came here with a powerful method. He was even sure that there was something wrong with the gourd, but his mind was still spinning rapidly, thinking of countermeasures. "You want a door? That's easy," Yutong said with a smile. "Can you open it with my Falling Gold Mountains magic tool? If Junior Brother Feng doesn't know how to use it, you can get it to me, and I'll open it for you. If that thing could be used, why would I wait until now?" Xiao Hua said coldly, curling his lips. "Oh, so it's like that. So you can't use that thing?" Yutong said patiently, like a cat catching a mouse. "You should have said it earlier. If you didn't say it, how would I know? If you said it, I would naturally know and open the door for you." Saying that, Yutong released the true Tiger Dharma body behind him. The true Tiger Dharma body flapped its wings, and sure enough, a silver light flashed on the wings, shooting at the wall not far from Yutong and Xiao Hua. The wall immediately transformed, and a door taller than a person appeared on it. Not only that, the silver light didn't stop and rushed straight through the door. So, behind the door, other doors appeared one after another, as if they were being pushed open by a big hand. "Junior brother phone, please." Yutong raised his hand and said with a smile. Humph, Xiao Huan naturally couldn't come out of the capital star array and innate primordial water. He rolled his eyes and said coldly, "I think this place is not bad, and suddenly I don't want to leave." Junior brother phone is really interesting. I didn't invite you before, but you came uninvited. Then I didn't want you to leave, but you insisted on rushing out. What about now? I let you leave, but you don't want to leave. Could it be you like to knock on the door with your head? My head is hard, so I like it. What are you going to do?" Xiao Hua was like a cat whose tail was stepped on, jumping up and roaring. "Nothing." Yutong shrugged. "I just want to say it." Seeing Yutong, who was younger than him and had a higher cultivation than him, also calling himself Little Master, Xiao Hua rubbed his chin and seemed to be in deep thought. After a moment of silence, Xiao Hua suddenly asked, "What are you holding in your hand?" Yutong raised his eyebrows and said with a smile, "What? Do you want to know? What's so great about it? Isn't it just the yin-yang sword gourd?" Xiao Hua sneered. "It's not like I haven't seen it before." You're really ignorant," Yutong said disdainfully, even showing off. "What yin-yang sword gourd? This is called soul-slaying vital light." Soul-slaying vital light? Xiao Hua didn't expect that Yutong didn't hide it at all and directly said it. When he slightly tasted it, his expression immediately changed. Was there even a need to say it? Yutong already thought of him as a dead person, so he took out the soul-slaying vital light and shared it with him, even teasing him with interest. "What is this soul-slaying vital light? Is it from Falling Gold Mountain? Or Washing Flower Sect?" Xiao Hua frowned, his somewhat frozen smile finally moving as he asked. "Junior brother Feng doesn't need to know." Yutong shook his head slightly. "If you don't want to say it, then forget it." Xiao Hua nodded. "How about this? If you want me to leave, then take this soul-slaying vital light as a farewell gift. I'll take this gourd and leave." Chapter 2654. Huh? Junior apprentice brother Feng. Could it be that you can read my mind? How do you know that I'm going to give this to junior brother? Yutong's astonishment was slightly exaggerated as he shouted. Xiao Hua did not dare to be negligent, and hurriedly urged the Buddha Saraira to circulate the innate primordial water, blocking the large gap and revealing a small gap. He shouted, "Forget it, forget it. A gentleman does not take what others like. You just refined this thing, you'd better keep it for yourself." How can I do that? A gentleman's word is as fast as a horse's whip. I'll send junior brother Feng off now. Yutong laughed loudly. He raised his hand, and the silver gourd flew into the air. Then, he pointed his finger at the gourd. Quick! 2 beams of light, one red and one green, flew out and pierced towards the azure, sentient true water. Good boy. When Xiao Hua saw that the sword light had arrived in a flash, he cried out in alarm and immediately activated the innate primordial water, covering all the gaps. However, the moment the 2 sword lights came into contact with the innate primordial water, the brilliance of the sword lights flashed through the innate primordial water, completely unaffected by it. Damn it! Xiao Hua was shocked. The speed of the 2 rays of sword light was too fast, and it was even more nimble inside the innate primordial water. He could not help but shout. Looking at the 2 rays of sword light, they did not directly rush into the capital star's array. Instead, it rapidly circled around the formation. However, in just a few breaths of time, the sword light pierced through the weak point of the Du Tian star formation with a buzzing sound. It immediately penetrated the formation and shot toward Xiao Hua's neck. Fight! Xiao Hua had already held the staff in his hand and did not hesitate to strike out. This was to send the 2 rays of sword light flying. However, just as the staff was about to touch the sword light slightly shook and cleverly dodged the staff. It did not allow Xiao Hua to do anything else and stabbed toward Xiao Hua's neck again. Shua. Xiao Hua's body flickered. It was the light protecting his body that was about to block the sword light. Unfortunately, the green and red sword light slashed through the light, protecting Xiao Hua's body, and a crack was immediately cut open on the golden light. The golden light flickered and was about to collapse. Motherfucker, this so-called soul-punishing vital light. Isn't it too powerful? Xiao Hua couldn't help but groan. His soul was about to scatter. As the green and red sword lights intertwined, Xiao Hua's head was about to soar into the sky like jade ice. Right at this critical moment, Xiao Hua hastily opened his mouth, and two red and green rays of light flew out. The two rays of light were like bolts of lightning, and they actually blasted the yin-yang sword chi away with two light cracking sounds. However, the yin-yang sword chi wasn't simply formidable because it was a flying sword, and it was more due to the connection between the two rays of light. The swaying brilliance didn't seem to be blasted away by the rays of light, and it continued to coil around Xiao Hua's neck. When Yutong saw Xiao Hua's two flying swords, he was clearly stunned. However, it was only for a moment, and he didn't care. But then, he couldn't help but frown. After the two flying swords blasted away the two rays of light, their own swords also slanted. However, at the same time, shwa shwa shwa, a series of light sounds rang out. The two flying swords rapidly shook, and the two flying swords transformed into four. The four flying swords then transformed again, and in the blink of an eye, 16 flying swords appeared out of thin air. These 16 flying swords were once again divided into two groups of green and red, and there were 8 of them each. They were right between Xiao Hua's neck, protecting him. Moreover, the moment the sword light extended, it hit the connection between the yin-yang sword chi. Kong! A sharp sound was extremely ear-piercing, like a sharp sword cutting through a hard rock. These 16 flying swords actually blocked the seemingly unstoppable yin-yang sword chi. This flying sword shadow technique. How'd you know? Yutong sucked in a breath of cold air and almost cried out in alarm. Seeing that the Dream Executor and the Mountain Splitter had blocked the yin-yang sword spirit's sword light, Xiao Hua's heart calmed down. He looked left and right at the constellation array and the innate primordial water. He clenched his hand, and dozens of rays of light flashed, putting away the constellation array. Since Yutong had the means to break this great array, Xiao Hua's array could only be a hindrance. After Yutong recovered from his shock, he saw Xiao Hua put away the array. He raised his eyebrows and said coldly, "You're just a disciple of the Huan Hua sect. How could you know such a flying sword technique? Where did you come from? Take advantage of this moment to tell me. If you have something to do with me, I may not necessarily not let you live. Moreover, you seem to have used the metal escape technique just now. Presumably, you also know the secret of the silver tiger magic tool. How could an ordinary cultivator discover the secret of the silver tiger magic tool in such a short time? I won't hide it from you. What I want to do is very big, and I need a lot of help. I can consider cooperating with you. The secret inside the magic tool. You can have a share." As Yutong spoke, the yin-yang sword spirit retreated slightly and stopped in midair. At this time, the two flying swords were very strange. The two flying swords were only about the length of a finger and were incomparably sparkling and translucent. When one's gaze swept over the flying swords, they would appear and disappear. Even when one's divine sense was at the location, they would flicker indefinitely. They seemed to exist in midair, but also seemed to not exist in midair. Putting aside the green and red colors on the two flying swords, there were also a few strands of silvery white within the green and red colors. These green and red colors seemed to be alive. When the flying swords appeared, they moved around in an extremely orderly manner. At first glance, it was as if two eyes were showing an indescribable expression. At this time, Xiao Hua's two flying swords turned into 16 and lined up in front of him. They also overflowed with green and red colors, but it was very obvious that within the brilliance of the Dream Slayer and the Mountain Splitter, there was an abundance of baleful aura, but not enough nimbleness. While listening to Yutong's persuasion, Xiao Hua's divine sense swept over the yin-yang sword spirit. He inwardly sighed that the yin-yang sword spirit, which was refined by Yu Qingtian and Zhang Yue's souls and sacrificed with the blood of nearly 100,000 creatures, was indeed fierce. At the same time, he inwardly pondered. He was somewhat puzzled by Yutong's words. What do you mean it has something to do with him? What do you mean by ordinary cultivators can't see through the secret of this magic tool? Could it be this guy already knew about the legacy realm mentioned in the magic tool? However, as a rogue cultivator, Xiao Hua had long heard this kind of affectionate persuasion to stay countless times. He had long seen this kind of heartfelt persuasion. Among these persuasion and persuasion, which one of them wasn't temporary? Which one of them wasn't a contest of strength? If I leave this formation, Xiao Hua coldly snorted. Would I still be afraid of you? However, Xiao Hua slightly changed his mind. When he thought of this, how could Yutong, who had been scheming against Zhang Yuhe for dozens of years, not know? He definitely wouldn't be at ease if he left. Moreover, when he thought about how Yutong and the others treated the 100,000 creatures as nothing and wantonly hunted them in order to increase their cultivation. Even if he wanted to cooperate with someone, he absolutely wouldn't choose them. With this thought, Xiao Hua burst into laughter. I don't care what kind of bullshit person you are. I don't want to have any relationship with you. Previously, I avoided the battle because I didn't want to be nosy. Now that you insist on forcing me to make a move, don't blame me for being ruthless. Yutong's laughter seemed to be louder than Xiao Hua's. He also looked at Xiao Hua with interest and even said somewhat arrogantly, "Little guy, who doesn't know how to be overbearing? But you also need to have strength. Don't think that just because you know how to transform flying swords into shadows, you could be arrogant in front of me. I'll let you see what the soul-slaying primary light is." As he spoke, two flying swords as thin as cicada's wings suddenly let out a rumbling sound. Yutong didn't seem to activate any spells, but they stabbed toward Xiao Hua. That kind of indescribable sharpness immediately pierced between Xiao Hua's eyebrows. "Who's afraid of you?" Xiao Hua pointed his finger. The 16 flying swords also moved in the air. There was some mysterious connection between them. Their flying speed was extremely fast, blocking in front of the oncoming yin-yang sword light. Whoosh, the green-red yin-yang sword light really did have intelligence. As if playing hide-and-seek, it casually weaved between the 16 flying swords. In the blink of an eye, it dodged the attacks of the Soul Slayer and the Mountain Slayer, and once again approached Xiao Hua. Xiao Hua's hand seals changed again. Whoosh, 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 a series of sounds rang out. 32, 64, and finally 128 sword lights flew out and blocked in front of the yin-yang sword light with extreme speed. As expected, you have some skill. Yutong beamed with joy. This was the first time Xiao Hua had used two flying swords. 128 sword lights. At first, these 100 sword lights were somewhat clumsy, but following the urging of Xiao Hua's divine sense, they gradually became orderly. These sword lights even faintly formed a sword array, encircling the yin and yang sword lights. Although the two flying swords with intelligence were incomparably nimble, they were unable to withstand the overwhelming number of swords. For the time being, they had no way of flying out. Not bad, not bad. In the distance, Yutong actually clapped his hands and praised, "The Rinsing Flower sect actually has a disciple like you. This is really beyond my expectations." Not only that, Xiao Hua raised his head and sneered. "Today, I'll let you see what this young master is capable of." While speaking, Xiao Hua didn't seem to make any movements. The innate primordial water that previously surrounded Xiao Hua suddenly surged with waves. Those waves condensed in midair, and like a fist, smashed towards Yutong. "Come on!" Yutong shouted loudly. His shoulders shook, and the true tiger Dharmakaya was released again. Roar! The true tiger Dharmakaya roared loudly, and a pair of fleshy wings flapped. Suddenly, out of nowhere, two silver-white brilliances gushed out. These brilliances were like clear springs rushing towards the innate primordial water. Boom! With a loud sound, the brilliances blocked the primordial water. The primordial water fell to the ground like a huge rock, hitting the defensive silver brilliance. With a loud sound, the primordial water suddenly scattered in all directions, and the silver brilliance was also shattered into pieces. Yu Tong's Dharmakaya is powerful, Xiao Hua thought to himself. Fighting in this Buddhist gold formation, he has the absolute advantage. But so what? Xiao Hua's Buddha, Saraira, once again activated the innate primordial water. This primordial water actually didn't condense, but instead turned into a net in midair, covering Yu Tong's head. Chapter 2655. Yu Tong's eyes flashed with astonishment. He looked at the 100 or so swords fighting with the yin and yang swords, then looked at the net of primordial water. He really didn't understand. For an ordinary golden core cultivator, controlling 100 sword lights with only his divine was probably already his limit. Even if Xiao Hua was far more powerful than an ordinary golden core cultivator, he could still split a part of his divine will to control the innate primordial water. However, that part of his divine will could only turn the innate primordial water into waves, but now he could actually pull the innate primordial water into a net. The difference between this net and waves was not just a little bit. A complicated expression flashed through Yu Tong's eyes. The true tiger dharma body spat out several mouthfuls of silver light, as well as the silver light from its fleshy wings, forming layers of defense in front of the primordial water. Rumble, another earth-shattering collision sound rang out. The two of them were still evenly matched in their battle. Feng Ying. Yu Tong first called him Junior Marshal Brother Feng from Marshal Nephew Feng, and now he called him by his name. I'm afraid your ability ends here. This young master will ask you one last time. Do you want to submit to this young master? Ha ha ha, Yu Tong. What ability do you have? You dare to make this young master submit? At this time, Xiao Hua didn't even use his sword art. He was laughing so hard that he swayed back and forth. Without the protection of the capital star array, he simply threw caution to the wind and prepared to fight against this peak late golden core or even early nascent soul cultivator. Yu Tong's face gradually turned ashen, looking extremely unsightly. Previously, it was extremely easy to seize the position of falling Golden Mountain sect master and even kill Zhang Yuhe, but the satisfaction had long disappeared. He coldly snorted and said, "This sect master saw that you were a talent. So this sect master cherished talent and wanted to use you and the others as my wings. Since you don't want to choose the path of the sun, this young master will give it to you and Zhang Yuhe." As he spoke, Yu Tong very solemnly waved his hand. His hands formed seals, and the surrounding spiritual energy of heaven and earth swarmed over. Even some sword intent and sword chi from some places of the Buddhist gold great array were drawn over. After a moment, with a silver light flashed, a long spear about 10 feet long condensed. The spiritual energy inside the fist-thick spear shaft was so dense that it almost condensed into substance. Go! Yu Tong swung his spear as if it was light. The long spear emitted a fierce cry, swaying with a silvery white brilliance as it pierced towards Xiao Hua's chest. He had only flown a few feet when a powerful force was transmitted from the long spear. It seemed as if the surrounding air was about to be pierced through, making a chi-chi sound. Xiao Hua's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked coldly at the spear. When the spear was closer, he waved his hand and took out the wishful steel staff again. His figure swayed and flew up like a gust of wind, smashing towards the spear. Seeing Xiao Hua take out the wishful staff, Yu Tong's face showed a trace of regret. Obviously, he had forgotten about Xiao Hua's magic tool. However, this regret disappeared in a flash. Immediately after, Yu Tong's fingers moved like he was playing a pipa. A few silver-white rays of light arrived first and hit the long spear. Woo-woo! The long spear let out an extremely loud cry and suddenly transformed. Just like Xiao Hua's flying sword, it suddenly turned into 4 spears and stabbed towards Xiao Hua from 4 different angles. How could Xiao Hua be afraid of this? The wishful steel staff in his hand danced elegantly. With a series of pung 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 sounds, the long spear was actually broken into pieces by Xiao Hua. The powerful force on the long spear seemed to have no effect on Xiao Hua at all. Looking at the dancing sword light, then looking at the fierce collision between the innate real water and the real Tiger Dharma body, and then looking at Xiao Hua waving the wishful steel staff to fight with the long spear, Yutong's eyes almost fell out. He was not fighting with one person, it was simply fighting with 3 people. Is this still a Foundation establishment cultivator? Yutong almost groaned like everyone else and secretly smiled bitterly. But it was also because of this question that Yutong's eyes suddenly lit up as if he had thought of something. However, at this moment, he heard Xiao Hua's long roar and his figure skyrocketed. The wishful steel staff crossed through the air and smashed down like a mountain. It hit the 3 long spears at once. The 3 long spears flashed violently, as if they were about to collapse. Explode. Yutong hurriedly made a secret gesture in his hand. Rumble. The 3 sounds turned into a loud bang, and the strong impact enveloped Xiao Hua. In an instant, Xiao Hua was flipped over in midair. Xiao Hua's reaction was beyond Yutong's expectations. Xiao Hua's figure was almost like a floating leaf in the wind. Although he was a little out of control at first, he instantly regained his balance. However, when Yutong saw the direction Xiao Hua was flipped in, the expression on his face changed slightly, because Xiao Hua fell near the yin-yang sword gore that Yutong had previously raised in midair. How dare you? Yutong was a little panicked. He was almost in a hurry to make a sword gesture, as if he wanted to take back the yin-yang sword gourd. Ha ha ha! This thing is kindly accepted by this young master. Although Xiao Hua had not yet approached the sword gourd, he waved his hand and used the heaven and earth technique to cover the sword gourd that was shaking in midair and had not been taken back by Yutong. Yutong tried his best to take it back, but Xiao Hua had already arrived. A strong confining force covered the sword gourd, and the connection between Yutong and the sword gourd disappeared. Yutong gritted his teeth, but Xiao Hua said with a smile, "Many thanks." But when he wrapped his mind and wanted to take the sword gourd into his space, an incomparable shock came from the sword gourd. A sharpness that was 100 times sharper than a flying sword flew out from the sword gourd's mouth and locked Xiao Hua's mind in an instant. Xiao Hua was so scared that his face turned ashen. He hurriedly withdrew his mind, but an extremely dim green-red color rushed out from the sword gourd. It was like the green-red sword light from before, and it pierced towards Xiao Hua's face. With a sharp sound, Xiao Hua's Taoist robe was shattered by this green-red color and turned into flying butterflies. Pooh! With another sharp sound, the green-red sword light pierced Xiao Hua's palm that was covering the sword gourd. With a slight turn, it passed through his palm. Xiao Hua's body had been tempered thousands of times, and ordinary magic tools could not compare to it. Unexpectedly, it was easily pierced by this green-red color. The pain that he had not felt for a long time came, and Xiao Hua could not help but cry out. However, just as he cried out, the green-red color arrived at his face. Pooh! Xiao Hua did not have time to think and spat out a wisp of spirit fire. The scarlet-red color immediately flashed, and in an instant, it turned into a wisp and burned towards the green-red color. Ha ha! Yutong laughed loudly in the distance, and there was no longer the panic from before. You think this young master did not guard against this move of yours? You took this young master's ancestral magic tool, and you want to take this young master's sword gourd. You are really too greedy. This is soaring scarlet fire? How could this item appear in Dawn Rain Continent? However, just as Yutong was shocked, another change suddenly occurred. The green-red light that was about to be burned by the soaring scarlet fire suddenly turned back and almost instantly fell into the sword gourd. Looking at the sword gourd again, it was the 2 drops of blood that had dripped from Xiao Hua's hand that had just been pierced. At this moment, those drops of blood had merged into the sword gourd, and a layer of light gold was born from the blood drops. On the sword gourd, a layer of dark green mixed with the silver-white color appeared and rolled towards the golden color. What is going on now? Just as this thought appeared in Yutong's mind, he saw that at the bottom of the sword gourd, a layer of light gold rushed out, and like Xiao Hua's drop of blood, it attacked the dark green and the silver-white color. Yutong suddenly remembered this sword gourd seemed to be Xiao Hua's from the beginning. Xiao Hua saw the green-red light shrink into the sword gourd. How could he not know that he had secretly done something to this sword gourd? The true essence in his meridians immediately rushed out, and the refined spell smashed towards the sword gourd with full force. You dare! Seeing the golden light on the sword gourd, Yutong was even more furious. As his figure flew, he slapped his hand, and the pressure of a late gold core stage immediately pressed down on Xiao Hua. Bitter. In fact, Xiao Hua was most afraid of this pressure. Without the support of the Phoenix celestial body, he was definitely not the opponent of Yutong's pressure. Seeing the pressure coming, the true essence in his body began to stagnate. Xiao Hua clenched his teeth and used one hand to control the sword gourd, and the other to put away the wishful staff. He struggled to take out his broken nascent soul hand. As soon as the talisman flew out of the space, it immediately let out a whimper, and the surrounding spiritual energy swarmed in like a hurricane. You want to use a talisman in my great array? You're simply dreaming. Yutong's words were accompanied by pressure, and it was truly majestic. Yutong's eyes flashed with a strange brilliance, and a strong, old divine sense swept out from between his eyebrows, covering the space around the talisman. The divine sense was like an iron wall, and it suddenly sealed the space. The golden spiritual energy could not penetrate at all. Xiao Hua's nascent soul hand talisman had just absorbed 20% of the spiritual energy, and it had not yet transformed into a palm. It flashed a few more times and slowly fell down, once again returning to a broken talisman. I don't know if this talisman can be used again. The divine sense cut off the spiritual energy source of the talisman, and then it contracted again, tightly wrapping around Xiao Hua. Moreover, under the pressure, Xiao Hua's whole body was imprisoned, and the true essence in his meridians was quickly condensing, and he could not use any of his magic power. Xiao Hua tried his best to use the fire control technique to control the spirit fire, but the spirit fire was unable to compare to this spirit fire. It was even to the extent that because he didn't have any magic energy to activate it, Xiao Hua was unable to execute the universe in the sleeve technique, and the sword gourd was about to escape his control again. Chapter 2656. What should I do? Xiao Hua's mind turned sharply. He wanted to take out the wishful steel staff to see if he could defeat this pressure. However, he was firmly suppressed by the spiritual sense and pressure. It was very obvious that Yutong's spiritual sense was not an ordinary cultivator. He must also have some kind of secret technique. Damn it, today this young master has really met his nemesis. Xiao Hua, who was trapped in a hopeless situation, suddenly became clear. This guy just said something about the flying sword shadow transformation technique. He even said something about towering scarlet fire. And he even said, how could Dawn Rain Continent have such a thing? Could it be that this guy? Moreover, he still has something important to do. What is it? Alas, now that things have come to this young master, is it still useful to think about these things? Xiao Hua's whole body was suppressed. Not only was his body unable to move, even his meridians could not operate the dragon transformation art. He could not use the Deva body bestowment technique. Even the innate primordial water controlled by the Buddha Saraira and the flying sword's execution dream and mountain splitter stopped. In an instant, it seemed that everything around Xiao Hua was stagnant. Everything stopped. Everything was quiet. However, in the moment when everything stopped, an extremely mysterious fluctuation came from Xiao Hua's lower dantian, between the male and female inner cores. Between the two thunder cores was a looming shadow. At this time, With the emergence of the fluctuation, it shrank extremely quickly. After shrinking to the limit, it suddenly collapsed. However, right after it collapsed, a powerful suction force suddenly appeared from the point of collapse. This suction force first grabbed the two thunder cores. However, the thunder cores were originally revolving around this point. When they were pulled near the point, they could no longer be absorbed. The thunder from the two thunder cores struck this invisible point. Gotcha! A light purple thing was born from the point of collapse. The suction force went past the thunder cores and very naturally sucked towards the meridians connected to the lower dantian. This suction force was so powerful and mysterious that it contained the power of the heavenly Tao. How could Yutong's divine sense and pressure contend against it? The true essence in the meridians instantly flowed and rushed towards the light purple point in the lower dantian. Core condensation. Xiao Hua sensed the changes in the true essence within his body and suddenly came to a realization. He had been looking for an opportunity to condense the core, but he had no clue. In Zhen Qing's experience, she had mentioned the stagnation of the true yuan. However, the stagnation of the true yuan only occurred after the core was condensed. As for the core, there were different theories. When it came to Xiao Hua, all of his cultivation methods had to stop, and all of his Zhen Yuan had to stagnate. In this stillness, he had to create something out of nothing to truly condense his Dan. If someone else were to say this, how could Xiao Hua believe it? His dragon transformation art, his heavenly man body empowerment technique, and his bone tempering technique were all in operation at all times. How could he possibly stop? It was only when facing a powerful enemy like Yutong that he was able to condense his core in a situation even more desperate than a desperate situation, right? Oh, this guy is actually condensing his core at this time? Yutong couldn't sense the changes in Xiao Hua's body, but when his pressure and divine sense were defeated, he naturally thought of it. Too bad you picked the wrong place. This was the Buddhist Gold Great Array, and you have a late Gold Core stage opponent in front of you. Yutong sneered. His divine sense expanded again, wanting to block the spread of Xiao Hua's divine sense. He even wanted to block the condensation of the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Wanting to strangle Xiao Hua the moment he condensed his Dan. Then, just as Yutong's divine sense spread out, an indescribable pressure came from Xiao Hua's body and hit Yutong's pressure. Rumble, the sound was comparable to the sound of heaven and earth shattering. Xiao Hua's pressure was like a newborn calf that was not afraid of tiger. It pressed down on Yutong's pressure, and the two made a huge noise. Not good. Yutong faced Xiao Hua's tide-like pressure. Although he felt it was insignificant at first, the pressure was so penetrative that it could gradually compete with his own pressure. However, this wasn't what shocked Yutong the most. What puzzled Yutong the most was that Xiao Hua's divine sense had been released along with his pressure. That divine sense actually wasn't inferior to his own, and it was even to the extent that Xiao Hua's divine sense was able to counterattack when he utilized a secret technique to stop Xiao Hua. In just a few breaths of time, Xiao Hua's pressure not only became more powerful, but his divine sense also rushed out like a surging spring, crushing Yutong's divine sense that he was so proud of. It was really a crushing defeat. Yutong's divine sense was the same. In front of Xiao Hua's majestic and powerful divine sense, Yutong's divine sense hastily retracted. Even the pressure that could compete with Xiao Hua's didn't dare to continue fighting. When Yutong saw Xiao Hua's aura seeping out of the Brahma Gold Great Array and his divine sense penetrating the sword tomb, a powerful sealing force descended from the sky and gradually enveloped the entire Brahma Gold Great Array. Yutong turned pale with fright. Are you a core condensation cultivator or a nascent cultivator? Because Yutong was very clear that this confinement force was unique to cultivators when they advanced. Even when he was pregnant, the confinement force could not compare to this, right? At this point, how could he dare to stay here any longer? Glancing at the blade gourd that was overflowing with golden light and silvery white color, He tried to sense it, but didn't find any special reaction. Immediately, the silvery white brilliance around his body flourished. The real tiger Dharma body roared and immediately disappeared in midair. Where do you think you're going? Xiao Huan naturally took advantage of the other's weakness to take his life. How could he let Yutong escape? Not bothering to take the Chinli pill, the Buddha Sarira urged the innate true water to rush towards Yutong. However, in his divine sense, Yutong had already disappeared. Wherever the true water passed, there was no trace of Yutong. The Yutong was also amazing. Using the metal escape technique, he left the Buddhist gold great array in a moment. When he sensed the location of Xiao Hua's divine sense, he even ignored the Buddhist gold great array and used the metal escape technique to escape with the help of the Sword Mound's golden nature spiritual energy. After traveling for over 100 miles, Yutong finally revealed himself with a panicked expression on his face. He sensed his divine sense and looked behind him. Powerful hurricanes had been stirred in the air, and at the center of these hurricanes was a tiny virtual spot. As these hurricanes grew stronger, that gradually revealed a sparkling silver-white light. As soon as this light dot appeared, it immediately condensed and enlarged, becoming the size of a grain of rice in a moment. Yutong's eyes narrowed, closely staring at these floating crystals. He knew that this was the celestial phenomenon of Xiao Hua's advancement. However, when the crystal grew bigger and bigger, growing to the size of a thumb, it did not stop. Chapter 26:57. The entire sky was filled with this crystal. The crystal grew to the size of a fist. Even the fist-sized crystal was still surrounded by a huge whirlpool, and the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth was constantly gathering in the whirlpool. The crystal was still growing, and large silver-white crystals gradually condensed, floating in the sky above the sword tomb. The crystals were multi-edged and looked extremely beautiful. At this time, Yutong's expression was even more shocked. However, this large silver-white crystal did not stop condensing and spreading, and it was still extremely stable as it extended into the distance. Which master is this? It's actually, before he could say actually, he heard a kacha sound of thunder. In the sky more than 100 li above the sword tomb, heavenly lightning flashed that had never appeared before. This is lightning tribulation? Seeing the golden heavenly lightning in the sky, which was completely different from what he usually saw, Yutong's expression changed. It's a demonic beast's third gold tribulation? Damn it, this Feng Ying is actually a demonic beast in human form. He even cultivated to the nascent soul stage. Yutong's eyes flashed with understanding, and his body trembled. How could he dare to stay for even half a moment longer? His body swayed, and he fled towards where he went. However, the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth around him was completely condensed, and for a moment, there really was not enough spiritual energy for him to use the gold escape technique. Yutong could only use the flying technique in a panic, and flew out a full 200 li before that sparkling and translucent silver-white crystal gradually disappeared. This kind of advancement power other than the nascent soul stage. What else could it be? However, he still had some doubts in his heart. First of all, this was extremely likely to be a demonic beast in human form. The nascent soul stage's power was shocking, but it seemed to be different from an ordinary cultivator's nascent soul stage. Especially that pressure. Why was it the same as a golden core stage? In fact, the nascent soul stage did not even appear. Of course, these doubts flashed past. After all, Feng Ying was a demonic beast in human form, and it was probably different from an ordinary cultivator's nascent soul stage. Secondly, within 100 li, it was Xiao Hua's divine sense. Why? Xiao Hua's method did not chase out? Even if this was the key to conceiving a nascent soul, it was not too difficult to take advantage of the confinement of the heavenly Tao to kill him. Of course, In the end, these doubts turned into joy for Yutong. If it weren't for these mistakes, would he have been able to escape with his life? Actually, it wasn't that Xiao Hua didn't want to kill Yutong. After all, Yutong knew his bottom line. He didn't want this person to live on the Dawn Rain continent. However, just as Xiao Hua wanted to use the restriction to advance, a tearing pain suddenly appeared in his lower dantian. It was as if his entire dantian was being torn apart. Xiao Hua turned pale with fright and hurriedly split his divine sense into a strand of inner vision. When Xiao Hua's divine sense sank into his lower dantian, he was so scared that 2 of his 3 souls left his body. He didn't know what to do. How could he still care about killing Yutong? Northeast of where Xiao Hua and Ning Dan were, LV Ruochang couldn't restrain her ecstasy. She looked at the other illusory swordsmen who were also surprised. She didn't hide her joy and said loudly, "Fellow swordsmen, the heavens didn't disappoint our brave warriors. Now, it's finally our turn to reap the fruits of victory. Let's go." After saying that, LV Ruochang took the lead and flew into the distance. Junior sister LV, Ruo Ling, was naturally happy as well. She glanced at the people beside her and shouted as she flew. Although the Dao Sect's cultivators have already caught up and are about to fall into Junior sister's hands, we've lost too many disciples. However, we have lost too many disciples. There are only 70,000 disciples here. Moreover, we are all injured. We may not be able to fight against the cultivators. In your earlier arrangements, I wonder if we've also made arrangements? Don't worry, senior sister Ruo Ling, LV Ruochang said proudly. Although I've placed you and me in the formation earlier, I've also placed the Skyscraper Sword Sect, the High Wind Sword Sect, and even Valley Master Chi Peng of the Swarm of Macaw's Valley. However, the battle situation has changed, and I've already made some arrangements. Although the power of the sword formation won't be as great as imagined, I guarantee that even without you and me, none of the hundreds of thousands of Dao Sect's cultivators will be able to escape from the great square sword formation. Heh. Zhu Qia also flew over and said with a smile, "I don't wish to kill all of these cultivators. I only wish to kill most of them and avenge sword friend San Yuan." Also, sword friend LV Muting also suggested, "I don't know how powerful the great square sword formation is, but I feel that it's better to leave a barely discernible way out. Otherwise, if the Dao Sect's cultivators go all out and fight with their lives on the line, I'm afraid that we'll suffer even more losses." LV Ruochang flew on her sword in the air. Her thin lips curled slightly as she sneered. "Sword friend Mu is right, but how many of my sword domain's warriors have been killed by the cultivators? I wish I could stab them to death one by one. Moreover, I've put in so much effort to set up the great square sword formation in order to capture all of them in one fell swoop. I'm afraid that it'll be difficult to show mercy now." "Sword friend Mu didn't want you to show mercy," Ruoling said with a smile. She merely saw the Dao Sect's cultivators' weakness in setting up the formation and warned you not to kill them all. She wanted to prevent the Dao Sect's cultivators from doing anything desperate. I understand." LV Ruochang was very respectful towards Ruoling and said with a smile, "How could there be any weakness in the great square sword formation? There's no way out. If the cultivators have any tricks up their sleeves, they can use them all. I'll take them all on." Seeing that LV Ruochang was so confident, no one was willing to say anything else. Their thoughts were the same as LV Ruochang's. They wished for the cultivators to all die. If they could kill 10,000, they definitely wouldn't stop at 9,999. After flying for half a meal, a swordsman wearing a pitch-black sword robe suddenly appeared in the air. The pouring rain seemed to directly rush into the swordsman's body, but also seemed to fall from the swordsman's sword formation. In short, it made people feel that this person was just an illusion. "Sword friendy?" LV Ruochang seemed to be unable to recognize this swordsman and asked tentatively, "Sword friend LV." The swordsman's sword robe was very strange. It hid his head and face, and even the people's divine senses couldn't penetrate it. That person heard LV Ruochang's question and replied, I've been waiting here for a long time. Thank you, sword friend Yi. LV Ruochang was very respectful towards this swordsman. He cupped his hands and said, "After this battle, I'll definitely fulfill my promise to sword friend Yi." I hope so. Swordsman Yi wasn't respectful because of LV Ruochang's respect. He just waved his hand and said casually. LV Ruochang didn't mind and asked again, "Sword friend Ye's matter. How are the arrangements?" "That's why I came to see you." That swordsman didn't answer directly. "I don't know if the matter you promised me. Can I take action now?" "Good." LV Ruochang nodded. "According to our previous agreement, sword friend, you can take action when you see my signal. It's a deal." As Swordsman Yi spoke, his figure actually dissipated. It was as if he was washed away by the rain and disappeared. Sword friend LV. This person. Ruo Ling was very surprised as she watched Swordsman Yi disappear and asked softly. However, LV Ruochang didn't answer. Instead, he smiled slightly. That smile was filled with mystery. Everyone flew forward again. After half a meal's time, a figure flew over from afar and landed in front of everyone. It was an old man with a sharp mouth. Everyone was familiar with this old man. It was Qing Feng of the Quilted Mountain sect. "Greetings, sword friend LV." Qing Feng cupped his hands and said as he looked around. "Greetings, sword friend Qing Feng." LV Ruochang faced Qing Feng and clearly wasn't as respectful as he was towards Swordsman Yi. He said indifferently, "Have you arranged the array that I instructed you to do? I'll let sword friend LV and the other sword friends know." Qing Feng had a bitter expression on his face. It was unknown if it was his original expression or if it was something he couldn't say. He said, "This sword has followed sword friend LV's arrangements completely. Everything is in place." "Good. After this battle, your Quilted Mountain sect will have done a great service." LV Ruochang nodded. "Senior brother Tsang Yuan." Qing Feng clearly didn't discover Tsang Yuan's whereabouts and could only ask. "Alas, sword friend Tsang Yuan died in the Dao sect's array." LV Ruochang sighed and said, "You set up the spirit-devouring array and kill as many cultivators as you can to avenge sword friend Tsang Yuan." "Yes, this old man understands." Qing Feng nodded sadly. He cupped his hands and flew up again. That hunchback of his became even hunchier. Spirit-devouring array? Mu Ting's eyes turned rapidly. She had heard that the spirit-devouring array needed to be set up, and that the spirit-devouring bugs used in this array had to go through many twists and turns because of the terrifying phoenix. However, she didn't expect that this array had already been set up by Qing Feng of the Quilted Mountain sect. Just as she was about to ask, LV Ruochang and Ruoling flew up again. Mu Ting turned her head and looked behind her. The brilliance of the Dao sect cultivators' Dharma treasures soared into the sky and almost dyed the night sky behind her. She didn't dare to stay any longer and hurriedly chased after them. Then, two more swordsmen came to greet them. One was by Tianming of the Three-Sword sect, and the other was Xiujia of the Coin-Sword sect. They were both second-grade illusory swords. When they saw LV Ruochang, the first thing he said was, "Have you finished setting up the sword array?" The two of them said the same thing. "We've been waiting for a long time." When Ruoling and the others saw Qing Feng of the Quilted Mountain sect, they were familiar with him. However, when they saw the Three-Sword sect and the Coin-Sword sect that didn't reveal themselves in the sword battle, they suddenly realized that these second-rate sword sect had been sent here by LV Ruochang to set up the array. It was no wonder that LV Ruochang was so depressed when she was trapped in the 10-direction annihilation array. LV Ruochang still had many other arrangements in the sword tomb. Chapter 2658. However, Zhu Qingye immediately had a trace of doubt. He was not the first batch of disciples sent out by the Bright Sword sect. He was appointed after Zhong Haoshuan of the Bright Sword sect was killed by Xiaohua. After he came to the battlefield, although he had heard about the giants and dwarves participating in the battle, he did not see much of it. Even his friend, Ji Minka of the Matian Sword sect, was nowhere to be seen. However, if Ji Minka was also setting up a formation in the sword tomb, why would these grade 2 illusory swordsmen, come out to greet them. Why would Minka, a grade 3 illusory swordsman, avoid meeting them? At this time, LV Ruochang also sent away Xiojia the Kunjian sect and said, "Fellow swordsmen, 5 miles from here, there's a hill full of blooming purple jasmine flowers. Let's restrain our disciples and gather there." After saying that, he did not say another word. His figure turned into a sword and headed to the side. Although Zhu Qingye and the others were somewhat confused, they knew that this was a crucial moment. They all rushed to the sky and ordered their disciples to contact the disciples of their respective sword sects to gather in front of them. Just as LV Ruochang said, in the night rain, a hill with a radius of 1,000 feet was just 5 miles away. This was really a hill. It was less than 3 feet above the ground, and it was covered with purple jasmine flowers. In the pitch-black night, the rain was getting heavier. The large purple jasmine flowers had their buds lowered. Many of the purple jasmine flowers had withered. Pieces of purple color stuck to the ground or flowed down the hill with the flow of water rushing to the flat ground. When everyone arrived, LV Ruochang was already standing on the top of the hill. He raised his eyes and looked at the place where the cultivators came from. His eyes were burning with passion. The disciples of the Black Phoenix sword sect had already lined up neatly and gathered on one side of the hill. Although these disciples had a trace of a smile on their faces, looking at the broken sword equipment and the few thousand disciples, no one would be happy. Ruo Ling and the others flew to the top of the hill. The disciples of their respective sects also scattered around the hill in an orderly manner. "Disciples, do you know where this place is?" LV Ruochang looked at Ruo Ling and the others, then raised his head and shouted to the 70,000 disciples below the hill. The entire area below the hill was completely silent. Only the sound of raindrops could be heard. Even Ruo Ling and the others were at a loss in their hearts. Not to mention that it was a rainy night. Even if it was a sunny day, who would know what kind of ruins this huge sword tomb spanned for thousands of miles? Of course, everyone knew that there must be a story behind this hill, and it must be where the sword cultivator had suffered a crushing defeat. But sword cultivators had suffered crushing defeats so many times, who would know which one it was? However, LV Ruochang didn't speak immediately when no one spoke. Instead, her bright and spirited eyes scanned the swordsmen one by one. That aggressive gaze made every swordsman lower their heads in shame. After half a cup of tea's time, the sound of Dao sect cultivators flying through the air could be heard in the distance. LV Ruochang then said angrily, "It's not that I want to blame everyone here today, but the ancestors of my sword domain have shed their blood in the sword domain. Who knows how many people have been buried? Their hope of defeating the Dao sect had yet to be fulfilled. We may not be talented. We may not have the hot-bloodedness of these ancestors. We may not have the cultivation of these seniors. But we cannot lack the spirit of the sword domain seniors to pass down the torch. We cannot lack the determination to carve this humiliation into our hearts and our lofty bones. Our seniors of the sword domain have suffered defeat after defeat. They have used their unyielding spirit as a seed to plant in their hearts, in the hearts of all the warriors of the sword domain. We have all grown up listening to the deeds of our seniors of the sword domain. Every one of us has the shadow of a senior in our hearts. LV Ruochang spoke passionately. We all want to be like the heroes in our hearts whose names resound throughout the sword domain. However, this is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that we cannot forget the humiliation that the Dao sect has inflicted on us for the past 10,000 years, or even 100,000 years. This humiliation can only be washed away with the blood and lives of the Dao sect cultivators. Look beneath your feet. This is an ordinary high slope. LV Ruochang pointed with his finger, his face filled with respect. That year, a famous sword sect in the sword domain, under the leadership of 2 sword transformation seniors, fought a decisive battle with the 3 Dao sect sects in the sword tomb. That sect fought until not a single disciple was left, and they dragged the other 3 sects to their deaths in the sword tomb. The two sword transformation seniors of that sword sect gave up on the chance to escape and were killed by 3 nascent soul cultivators from the 3 sects. Why did they do this? It was so that the sword domain's 16 sword sects would not be discovered by the Dao sect cultivators, so that the plan of the sword domain seniors could be carried out safely. However, during that great battle, the sword formation was discovered by the Dao sect cultivators in the end. In the end, they were unable to surround the cultivators, and in the end, they did not obtain victory in the battle. Richong's tone was somewhat sorrowful. Of course, in the end, this sword sect that was destroyed by the 3 Dao sects did not receive the glory that they deserved. Furthermore, after that great battle, this sword sect disappeared without a trace in the sword domain and never appeared again. Oh, so that's how it is. The group of swordsmen were all enlightened. However, since it was a sword sect that had been destroyed long ago, and it was not an extremely prominent sword sect, how would they know? What this sword wants to talk about is this nameless sword sect. There are so many of them in my sword domain, and there are also many swordsmen who silently died on the battlefield. Ruochang continued, no matter when we are, no matter if we are defeated or victorious, we cannot forget these nameless swordsmen and nameless sects. Jianyu. Ling suddenly came to a realization and cried out involuntarily, you're talking about the Flying Dragon Sword sect? This place is what the Dao sect swordsmen are called. The Dragon Punishing Slope? That's right. I didn't expect senior sister Ling to know about this. Ruochang's eyes revealed a trace of surprise. She did not expect Ling to know about the Flying Dragon Sword sect. Sigh, I'm ashamed to say this. Ling's face was somewhat miserable. This sword only happened to look through my sect's sword scroll when I was about to come to the battle and accidentally came across it. It's already good that senior sister can see it. Ruochang comforted. In today's sword domain, who would still remember the Flying Dragon Sword sect? Yes, that's right. Ling understood Ruochang's meaning and said loudly, disciples of the sword domain, about 8,000 years ago, there was a mysterious sword sect in my sword domain, and it was the Flying Dragon Sword sect. This sword sect's secret Flying Dragon Sword technique. Almost every disciple could comprehend the Flying Dragon Sword intent. It was very popular in the sword domain, and for hundreds of years, there was not a single sword sect in the sword domain that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the Flying Dragon Sword sect. Oh, the crowd of swordsmen was completely in an uproar. Almost all of their eyes flashed with disbelief. They seemed to have never heard of such a powerful sword sect. It's just as Jianyu said. During that great battle, the Flying Dragon Sword sect contributed greatly to my sword domain and killed countless cultivators, including nascent soul cultivators. Ling continued. At the same time, at the end of the great battle, the commander of my sword domain decided to set up a sword formation in the sword tomb, preparing to lure the Dao sect cultivators into the sword formation to surround and annihilate them. However, the news was leaked and the Dao sect cultivators rushed into the sword tomb ahead of time. Seeing that the swordsmen had yet to finish setting up the formation, the disciples of the Flying Dragon Sword sect volunteered to stop the Dao sect cultivators here and buy time for the warriors of my sword domain to set up the formation. In the end, even when the last person from the Flying Dragon Sword sect died, the sword formation was still not set up. We sword cultivators still lost that great battle. Ruochang continued. And in order to commemorate that great victory, the Dao sect cultivators named this place Dragon Slaying Slope. That's right, the contribution of the Flying Dragon Sword sect was great. Ling sighed again. Their elites were all killed in the great battle, and the disciples left in the sword domain were not outstanding. And then, seeing that Ling did not continue, Ruochang sneered. And then the Flying Dragon Sword sect was swallowed up by some sword sects and disappeared from the sword domain. Indeed, Ling said in a low voice. When this sword saw this, my heart was also filled with emotions. This kind of sword sect, we, the various sects of the sword domain, should properly protect them. LV Jianyu, Zhu Qingye frowned. The conditions of my sword domain are terrible. If there is no competition, no fighting, how can warriors be produced? The matter of the Flying Dragon Sword sect is definitely not intentional, Sword Friend mentioning it now. What Zhu Jianyu said is reasonable. LV Ruochang laughed. The survival of the fittest, this is the axiom of my sword domain. This sword once again said that this time, I do not have any intention of blaming any swordsman or any sword sect. This sword only wants to let you sword friends know that my sword domain has countless such swordsmen, countless such sword sects. We cannot forget them at any time. As long as we have their spirit with their actions, why should we worry about not being able to take down the Dao sect? Why should we worry about not being able to defeat the sword tomb? Yes, we understand. All the swordsmen said in unison. Good. LV Ruochang pointed again and said, since the beginning of the Dao Cultivator War, this sword has been planning to set up a killing sword formation at the dragon-slaying slope where the Flying Dragon Sword sect's swordsmen died, and kill the hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators one by one. Now, this sword's wish is finally half completed. Those stupid Jurassic Beast cultivators have indeed caught up. Right now, we are at the center of the great square sword formation that this sword has set up, and within a radius of 10 miles is the first great formation of the Great Square Sword Formation, the Yin-Yang Sword Formation. Then, LV Ruochang pointed outside and said, outside the Yin-Yang Sword Formation is the second great formation, the five-element splitting edge sword formation. Further outside is the third great formation, the Spirit Devouring Formation. As for the outermost layer, it is a mysterious formation. This sword has not thought of a good name for it, but I believe that after today's killing, this great formation will have an extremely resounding name tomorrow. Chapter 2659. Good. Mu Ting and the others were delighted when they heard this and immediately cheered. My sword domain's several sword sects have already set up this great square sword formation. We're just waiting for the stupid cultivators to take the bait. Lu Ruochang clapped his hands and took out several sword slips and said, disciples of the various sword sects, you've already worked hard. There's no need to attack in the sword formation. The sword sect disciples who set up the formation will activate the sword formation according to the previous practice. However, I'd like to ask all of you, are you willing to sit there and watch the other sword sect disciples kill the enemy? Are you willing to be hunted down by the cultivators? Don't you want to take revenge for the disciples who died on the battlefield? Can you be like the Flying Dragon Sword sect 10,000 years ago, exhausting your last bit of sword origin and killing the last cultivator? We're willing to assist the disciples who set up the formation. All of the swordsmen's blood boiled as they said in unison, for the great victory of my sword domain, for the extermination of the Dao sect's cultivators, even if I have to crush all of your bones, even if I have to destroy all of your sword sects, can you be like the Flying Dragon Sword sect with no regrets? Lu Ruochang shouted again. We're willing to sacrifice ourselves for the victory of sword domain, with no regrets. All of the swordsmen shouted without hesitation. Good. Lu Ruochang clapped his hands, and several sword slips flew into the hands of Ruo Ling, Mu Ting, and the other grade 3 illusory swordsmen. He said, sword friends, please lead the sword sect disciples to the 3 sword formations and kill the cultivators together with the other sword sect disciples. Yes, we'll obey. Zhu Qingye and the others received the sword slips and bowed. Then, they used their divine sense to look at them and ordered their disciples to lead the various sword sects in different directions. Naturally, Ruo Ling and the others were a little puzzled by Lu Ruochang's arrangement at Dragon Slaying Slope. They were even curious why Lu Ruochang suddenly brought forward the Flying Dragon Sword sect and asked all the disciples to imitate the Flying Dragon Sword sect and have no regrets even if the sect was destroyed. However, the situation was urgent at this time, and it was the key for the swordsmen to turn the tables. They only thought that LV Ruochang wanted to cover up his previous mistakes in command, so they didn't ask much. They flew everywhere according to LV Ruochang's instructions. Waiting until there were no more disciples in front of the dragon-slaying slope, LV Ruochang let out a long sigh. He raised his head and looked at the night sky. Although the night sky was pitch black, there were already traces of white light in the east. Obviously, dawn was coming. The rain is very heavy. It can wash away the blood and tears of the sword tomb. The wind is very strong. It can blow away the smoke of the sword tomb. However, although a long time has passed, it can't erase the hatred in the heart. Can the courage in the heart of a swordsman be washed away by time? LV Ruochang muttered to himself. Her voice was not loud and had long been drowned out by the sound of the rain. However, even though the sound of the rain was loud, it could not drown out the sound of hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators chasing after her. Hearing the sound getting closer and closer, LV Ruochang's mouth revealed a trace of coldness. The sword aura around her body gradually appeared, and the flying sword under her feet also glowed. She flew up from the dragon-slaying slope and flew towards the other side of the yin-yang sword formation. And in front of her, the disciples of the Black Phoenix sword sect who had already flown away revealed their sword splendor. This sword splendor faintly shone in the night sky, as if some lanterns were floating in the air, pointing out the direction in the night. There, quick! Chase after them. Kill all the swordsmen. After flying for a while, LV Ruochang stopped in the air and looked back. It seemed that there were arrogant figures of cultivators. LV Ruochang coldly looked at them. She clapped her hand, and a green flying sword appeared in her hand. The green and green sword aura on the flying sword reflected on her face, revealing a trace of malevolence within the snow-white skin. Whoosh! LV Ruochang activated the sword origin. The flying sword faced the curtain of rain and rushed into the night sky. When it reached a high altitude, it let out a clear cry. It was actually a huge phoenix. This phoenix cry was extremely loud and clear, and it resounded in the surrounding dozens of miles. Looking at LV Ruochang, who was quietly standing on the dragon-slaying slope, her body glowed with sword light, and she flew into the distance. On the dragon-slaying slope, other than the bright night rain, there were only the ruined purple jasmine flowers. It seemed that no one had ever stayed here. In the east, the sky was gradually turning white. It seemed that even the dawn was unwilling to be left out. It wanted to see this lively sword battle. The jade-green phoenix that charged into the sky naturally attracted the attention of hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators. Heng Jie's heart sank, and his divine sense hurriedly swept over. However, just like before, his divine sense was only able to sweep out a few hundred feet before it was restricted and couldn't reach far. Quick! Heng Zhao almost did not hesitate and turned to a disciple and shouted, "Turn around and go back." Before he could finish his sentence, he hurriedly looked to the side again. That disciple was a little confused and did not know what to do. He asked curiously, "Uncle Heng Ming, why are you turning around? Aren't you chasing after the sword cultivator?" Previously, when Li Zongbao was in the 10-direction annihilation spell, he did not activate the spell like the other disciples of the Utmost Happiness faction. Instead, he sat beside the spell and meditated. At this moment, when he was chasing after the sword cultivator, he accompanied Heng Zhao. When he heard Heng Zhao's order, he said calmly, "Master, don't worry. I will go ahead and check if I have fallen into the sword cultivator's ambush. I'll come back quickly." Heng Zhao was a little absent-minded. He waved his hand and flew up towards the huge, flashing phoenix in front of him. "Yes." Li Zongbao bowed and turned to instruct the disciples on his left and right. "Leave 30% of the disciples behind. Stay where you are and do not follow the other disciples." The disciple who did not know what to do earlier had a stern look on his face. He hurriedly bowed in agreement and hurriedly passed down the order. Li Zongbao stretched out his hand and held the immortal piercing whip in his hand. He turned around and flew into the air against the flow of hundreds of thousands of cultivators towards the back. LV Ruochang's phoenix flying sword condensed in the sky above the dragon's slaying slope and did not dissipate for a long time. In this slightly bright night sky, it was so dazzling. This phoenix attracted the attention of hundreds of thousands of cultivators. The Qi refining and foundation establishment disciples did not dare to overtake it. Without the orders of the Golden Core stage masters, they still pushed forward in the formation. However, it was obvious that their flying speed was much slower. They were preparing to deal with the change. Fellow cultivator Hung Ming Desun flew over first and said anxiously, there were still some traces of those sword cultivators who fled earlier. But in this moment, I did not even see a bit of sword light. Could it be? Fellow cultivator Desun, if you want to say that the slightest sound in the crane is scared out of its wits, it should be the sword cultivators. What does it have to do with us cultivators? Do you think that we have fallen into the ambush of the sword cultivators? Ji Hong snorted disdainfully. Wang Yi looked at the sword light in the sky in the distance. He bit his lips and said coldly, when did these barbaric sword cultivators learn to mislead soldiers? Could it be that they think that a signal like a message can scare us? Chapter 2660. Kill. Xiong Huasong said without hesitation. I don't believe that a sword cultivator can silently set up another sword formation outside my 10-direction annihilation formation. If that's the case, wouldn't it be the biggest joke in the world? Yes, Xiong Huasong didn't dare to believe it. Although this place was only 100 miles away from the 10-direction annihilation formation, if a sword cultivator made any movements here and set up a sword formation that could take down hundreds of thousands of cultivators, how could he not know? That's right, this is the empty city plan. In an instant, Hung Hung also made a decision and waved his hand. Disciples, kill, kill. When the disciples around Hung Hung heard the order, they all shouted in unison. This sound spread out and spread in waves. Close to 100,000 cultivators were shouting loudly, and the momentum was very threatening. Then, some of the hesitant cultivators once again increased their flying speed. However, even when they flew to the front of the dragon punishing slope and pushed under the phoenix sword intent, they still didn't see any traces of the swordsman. Moreover, in the distance, it was also pitch black, without a trace of sword brilliance. In addition, at this moment, it was the darkness before dawn. The previous trace of light had already disappeared, and the entire world was exceptionally dark. However, the torrential rain from before gradually lessened at this moment, and the rain began to fall intermittently. Hung Hung and the other Golden Core cultivators were also cautious at this time. First, they stopped the group of cultivators from advancing and sent 100 or so Foundation Establishment late-stage disciples to fly forward to explore the path. Then, Gao Wei, Xiong Huasong, and the others waved their hands and took out their magic treasures. Their figures flew straight into the sky, as if they wanted to explore the meaning of this huge phoenix. Hung Hung and the others looked at the figures of Xiong Huasong and the others while releasing their divine senses to carefully explore this extremely ordinary-looking slope. Boom! A loud sound rang out. Before Gao Wei and Xiong Huasong could fly close to this huge phoenix, the phoenix let out a deafening sound and turned into thousands of green sword lights, flying in all directions, clearly illuminating the surrounding several miles. Hundreds of thousands of Dao sect disciples formed a black mass within a radius of a couple of miles. They formed a spindle shape. Most of them were gathered near the dragon punishing slope. There were quite a number of them extending forward in front of them. Behind them, there were over 10,000 people who remained at the same spot. They appeared to be very cautious. The green sword brilliance only shone for an instant, and in the next moment, the entire dragon-slaying slope fell into darkness. Fellow Taoist Hung Ming Desun frowned and said, "This matter is rather strange. We need to be careful. In this old man's opinion, why don't you stop while you're ahead?" Fellow Taoist Desun. Ji Hong was a little unhappy. Just as she was about to say something, she suddenly heard a rumbling sound within 10 li of the dragon punishing slope. The ground shook violently. Not good. Flying high in the sky, Gao Wei, who had just landed, immediately panicked and said anxiously, "Let's go quickly. I'm afraid we've fallen into a sword cultivator's ambush." "Shut up." When Hung Ming heard this, he roared angrily, "Disciples, listen to my command. Form the usual defensive formation." Yes, when the group of disciples first heard Gao Wei's words, they were very flustered and almost wanted to scatter and flee. However, when they heard Hung Ming's words, they suppressed the fear in their hearts. Each small team formed a formation, each sect formed a formation, and in a moment, everything stabilized. Gao Wei was humiliated in front of everyone. His face was burning, but he did not even have the courage to glare at Hung Ming, because his shout just now was indeed too abrupt. Rumble. The earth's shaking did not stop. Instead, wave after wave, it became more and more intense. Even at the place where the thousands of green sword brilliance disappeared, faint sword brilliance gradually emerged from the darkness and flashed from the horizon. This. Although Xiong Huasong did not land, his voice could be heard. He was almost in disbelief and shock. How is this possible? We've actually fallen into a sword cultivator's ambush? Xiong Huasong was not the only one who did not dare to believe it. All the golden core cultivators in the meeting hall did not dare to believe it. The changes in this battle were too unpredictable. Even in their wildest dreams, they did not expect that the swordsmen who were about to be killed by them would actually set up such a huge sword formation when they were in a desperate situation. They had opened their pockets and were waiting for them to come in. Moreover, what puzzled the hundreds of thousands of cultivators was that they had really come in. This must be a trick to mislead the troops. Ji Hong shouted without hesitation. Lu Ruochang has less than 70,000 swordsmen under his command. How can they surround hundreds of thousands of cultivators? How can they set up such a huge sword formation? However, at this point, this female cultivator who was incomparably touched by Qian Mo's words suddenly had a brilliant flash of light in her mind, like all the other golden core cultivators. Ji Hong was dumbfounded. While Hung Lu was shocked, he coldly glanced at Ji Hong and said indifferently, "Taoist Ji Hong, did you see that? I've already said that we shouldn't pursue a cornered enemy, but for the sake of Taoist Qian Mo's blood feud, we still chased after them." Ji Hong heard the reproach in Hung Lu's tone. How could she not understand what he meant? Just as she was about to retort, she heard Hung Ju's tone change. She wasn't a fool, so she gritted her teeth and said, "That's right, this old one also knows not to pursue a cornered enemy." At that time, if we had stopped, even if these sword cultivators had laid down this sword array, they definitely wouldn't have been able to succeed. But if we didn't chase after them, how could we face our own conscience? How could we face Qian Mo, Li Chengxiu, and the other Taoists who died? When Hung Lu heard this, his heart was slightly relieved. However, De Sun's face was heavy as he said, "Fellow Taoists, don't blame yourselves. Previously, I felt that the end of this battle was a little strange and couldn't figure out where the sword cultivators had gone. It was impossible that there were only the hundreds of thousands of disciples led by LV Ruochang and the others. Now, their true purpose has been revealed. A portion of their disciples were setting up the sword formation in the sword tomb. They had set up an ambush here and were waiting to lure us in. From the looks of it, even if we don't take the bait this time, they will still have other ways to lure us in." Gao Wei hurriedly said, "This plan? I'm afraid that it had already started when we agreed on the 10-direction annihilation grand formation." "That's right," Xiong Huasong nodded and said, "And this old man is sure that this sword formation must have been set before the 10-direction annihilation grand formation. Otherwise, this old man would have known about it." Hung Lu nodded. Taoist Xiong's words are reasonable. Moreover, Taoist Xiong's grand formation did not attract the attention of the sword cultivators. It is indeed Taoist Xiong's great merit. It's nothing. Xiong Huasong was secretly proud, and at the same time, he said humbly, "Taoist Qian Mo's thoughts are actually the same as the sword cultivators." He is even more powerful. That's right. That's why we have to avenge him at all costs. Hung Lu hurriedly added, I'm afraid this is not the time to shirk responsibility. Li Jiji of the Changbai sect saw that the many golden core cultivators were actually not in a hurry to set up the formation, and instead talked about the reason for the ambush. He couldn't help but say coldly, wait until we kill our way out of the sword formation. Then it won't be too late to talk about other things. Hung Lu's face was slightly embarrassed, but he didn't care about Li Jijia's cold words. If he didn't explain clearly the responsibility of chasing and attacking, everyone would come to an agreement in their hearts. Even if he could lead the disciples of the Utopia faction to break out of the encirclement safely, he wouldn't feel at ease. Humph, the sword cultivators only have 70,000 people. They fell into our grand formation first and lost more than half of them. This so-called ambush and sword formation, I'm afraid it won't be intact. Ji Hong spoke again. We only need to set up the formation to deal with them. Do you think we're afraid of them? Xiang Ming of the Huanhua sect stood far away and didn't get too close. At this moment, he also opened his mouth and said, that's right, our Dao sect cultivators have more than 100,000 people. Just like the sword cultivators breaking through the formation, they are charging in the same direction. How can they not break out of the sword formation? At this moment, a figure flew over and stopped in front of Hung Lu. It was Li Zongbao, who had just flown back to check out the situation. Zongbao, what's the situation? Hung Lu raised his eyebrows and asked anxiously. Reporting to Master, Senior Uncles, and Senior Uncles. Li Zongbao bowed and said, the large group of people who came to kill the sword cultivators has been divided into two parts by the sword formation. The sword formation is green and red in color and is gradually taking shape. Golden chi and hurricanes are rising above the sword formation. I try to charge through the sword light, but the sword chi inside is very strange. Every time, a green and red sword light attacked me, as if they were cooperating with each other. It's very powerful. I can't break out of the encirclement, so I don't know the situation of the other group of disciples. Hung Lu nodded. This sound is also the sound of the sword formation? Yes. Li Zongbao answered. The green and red sword light was born from the ground of the sword tomb. It violently surged like a drum, and the ground within 100 feet collapsed. Many disciples tried to charge out before the collapse occurred, but they were all killed by the green and red sword light. Moreover, the collapse didn't stop when I came back. It seems that the sword formation's power is not small. Set up the formation. When Hung Lu heard that even Li Zongbao couldn't break through, he couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. However, he snorted coldly. Insignificant skill, you're really picking up the wisdom of others. We'll return now. Let's see how this sword formation can stop us. Good. How could Asun and the others not agree? They all clapped and praised. Hundreds of thousands of cultivators quickly arranged themselves into a formation in the shape of a sharp knife. However, hundreds of thousands of cultivators arranged themselves into a formation in the time it took to brew a cup of tea. During this time, the situation at the dragon-slaying slope changed again. The rumbling sound of the earthquake gradually approached from afar. Under the shaking of the ground, the purple jasmine flowers that couldn't be washed away by the heavy rain were all shaken off, leaving only the smooth purple flower stems. Looking at the green and red sword light that Li Zongbao mentioned, it soared into the sky from the ground in the distance, like a huge bonfire, surrounding hundreds of thousands of cultivators in an area of more than 10 miles. See, Hung Lu and the others' divine senses couldn't go very far, but they could see it clearly with their naked eyes. They couldn't help but gasp, setting up a sword formation in such a large area. Not to mention its power, the scale was probably much larger than the 10-direction annihilation formation. Chapter 2661. Hung even looked at Xiong Song. After all, this sword formation was so close to the magic formation. How could Xiong Song not notice it? Xiong Huasong's face was also extremely ugly. This was really a slap to his face. Although the sword catacomb was incomparably dangerous, and one's divine sense couldn't travel very far. But this was still a huge sword formation. It was right next to his magic formation. How could he not notice it? Could it be? Xiong Huasong suddenly had an idea in his mind. However, just as he was about to speak, there was a continuous rumbling sound. The vibration surrounding the dragon slaying slope intensified and spread extremely quickly. It had already rushed to the feet of the hundreds of thousands of cultivators and reached the vicinity of the dragon slaying slope. All disciples, pay attention, Hung Ming said loudly. Activate your magic power and advance towards where you came from. Boom! A huge sword cry directly suppressed Hung Heng's voice. At the place where the dragon's slaying slope was located, the ground of about 10 zhang had completely collapsed. Two sword lights that were thicker than pillars rushed into the sky. That biting cold sword chi and soaring sword light immediately illuminated the area within dozens of li in a green and red color. These two sword lights, one crimson red and the other azure, were like pillars that reached the sky, piercing straight into the sky. Ha ha ha, welcome, welcome. From within the sword pillar, a loud and clear voice sounded. When the cultivators raised their heads to look, they saw that from within the crimson sword pillar, a red-faced, muscular middle-aged swordsman wearing a red sword robe appeared, holding a similarly crimson flying sword in his hand. Who are you? Hung Hung looked at this unfamiliar swordsman and coldly said, Ha ha ha. That swordsman was still laughing. He took a step forward and flew out from the sword pillar, saying, This sword is the Supreme Harmony Sword Zhong Yang Jioding. A nobody. Looking at this second-grade, illusory swordsman, Li Jijie coldly said, if senior brother Yang is a nobody, then there is no need to talk about this sword. A laughter that sounded like a silver bell came from the azure sword formation. Following the flickering of a sword light, another petite and beautiful female swordsman wearing an azure sword formation flew out from the sword pillar. Junior sister Xiao. The corners of Yang Jioding's mouth curled into a smile as he said, The cultivators of the Dao sect have always been arrogant, and they look down on us swordsmen, not to mention us second-rate sword sects in the sword domain. However, they don't know any better, so we have to be polite. Junior sister, if you don't tell us your name, wouldn't they have died an unjust death when we kill them? Senior martial brother Yang's words make sense. The female swordsman chuckled and said, I am Xiojia of the Kuan Sword Sect. I'll be waiting for you. Don't forget my name when you reach the underworld. How dare you? Li Jijie scolded. You're just too great, too illusory swordsman, yet you dare to brag here. Senior martial brother, let me take their heads. The four cultivators beside Li Jijie looked at each other and said in unison, Okay. Li Jijie nodded slightly when he saw that they were four disciples of the early stage of the Golden Core Realm. When the four disciples saw that Li Jijie was doing the same, they waved their hands, and the flying swords in their hands flashed with brilliance. They flew up and flew towards Yang Jioding and Xiojia, who were leaning against the green and red sword pillars. The four of them had just flown a few feet when the brilliance around them flashed. 4 rays of sword light flashed with 4 colors. The sword chi rushed out of the flying swords and slightly intertwined in the air. It seemed that there was a strange connection between the 4 rays of sword light. The sword light began to rotate. When the 4 saw this, they shouted in unison, Quick! Immediately after, the flying swords in their hands shot out. Each hand formed a sword seal, and the 4 flying swords suddenly accelerated like shooting stars piercing the sun. The 4 flying swords gave birth to 4 different forces. These forces were not only extremely sharp, but they also cooperated with each other, trapping Yang Jioding and Xiojia in an area of dozens of feet. As expected of the disciples of the Changbai sect, they actually used the Dharma array technique on their flying swords. Yang Jioding sneered. However, Dharma arrays are all Dharma arrays. The flying swords inside are just Dharma artifacts. How can they compare to the sword array of us swordsmen? As he spoke, Yang Jiuding waved his hand very casually. It was like a fountain sprinkling a few drops of spring water. Several crimson sword lights pierced towards the 4 flying swords. However, when the crimson sword lights pierced a few feet in front of the flying swords, the 4 flying swords suddenly trembled and suddenly changed directions, stabbing towards Xiujie. Xiujie was originally smiling as he watched Yang Jiuding deal with the 4 flying swords. However, when the 4 flying swords changed directions, the crimson sword beams missed. Xiujie couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. Seeing the 4 flying swords close in on him, he also pointed with his finger. Several azure sword beams flew out from the azure sword pillar to meet the 4 flying swords. Under the control of the 4 early-stage golden core cultivators, the 4 flying swords turned into 4 streams of light and fiercely pierced towards the green sword lights that looked like thin threads. Just as the azure sword light was about to collide with the 4 streaks of light, the several azure sword lights twirled slightly and turned into a dozen streaks of light. At the same time, the crimson sword light that had missed its target suddenly changed direction and pierced towards the 4 streaks of light at a speed several hundred times faster than before. Crack, 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 for crisp sound could be heard as dozens of green-red sword silks circled around the 4 flying swords. These 4 flying swords of extraordinary quality were immediately sliced in half. Not good. The 4 flying swords were easily destroyed, and the 4 early-stage golden core cultivators' minds were seriously injured. They didn't dare to attack anymore and turned around to fly back. "Where do you think you're going?" Yang Jiuding shouted and pointed with his hand. A dozen rays of crimson sword lights fell from the sky and pierced towards the 4. Xiujie also controlled the green sword lights. A dozen rays of light circled around each other and pierced towards the 4 people like lightning. The 4 people were shocked, and their souls almost flew out of their bodies. Li Jijie snorted coldly in midair. The flying sword in his hand flew out and turned into a golden light. It rushed towards the green and red sword lights like a coiling dragon. Good timing. Seeing Li Jijie's sword light surpass the 4 people and was about to hit the green and red sword light, another low voice came from the sword pillar. A short old man with a face full of wrinkles flew out from the sword pillar. This old man's body flashed with the same green and red brilliance. He waved his hand and punched the flying sword. The old man appeared so suddenly that Li Jijie didn't have time to react. With a pung sound, Li Jijie's flying sword was hit by the old man's fist. The flying sword emitted a jie sound and flew down diagonally. Not good. When Li Jijie's flying sword was hit, his mind was also shaken. However, when he controlled the flying sword, his gaze fell on the dozen rays of light piercing towards him. Sure enough, without waiting for the dozen or so cyan-red sword lights to descend, the 4 of them clapped their hands together and 4 magic treasures flew out from their storage pouches. They were actually 4 identical shield-type defensive magic treasures. The 4 defensive magic treasures suddenly enlarged under the urging of the 4 people's magic power. They were now several feet in size and emitted a green-colored brilliance. This brilliance was extremely bright and protected the 4 people's bodies tightly. Moreover, it was very obvious that the brilliance of these 4 magic treasures lingered around each other, and the fluctuations of spiritual power were also linked. It was just like they were used to cooperating. However, when the dozen rays of light fell on the green brilliance of the magic treasures, they immediately intertwined. The green brilliance also shook violently and fought with the sword light. However, what shocked the 4 people was that this sword light was extremely different from the sword light they had encountered before. In the fight, it actually avoided the important part and focused on the trivial. It was like a strange tentacle that wandered around, as if it was looking for the weakness of the magic treasures. While the 4 people activated their magic treasures to defend, they quickly descended. However, at this moment, They heard Xiao Jie's sneer in their ears. The four people felt a chill in their hearts. Sure enough, following the sneer, a thin green sword light pierced into the gap between the two magic treasures that appeared in an instant. At the same time, another thin crimson sword radiance appeared along with the azure sword radiance in an even more bizarre manner. Fight! The heart of the golden core, disciple closest to the two sword lights tightened. With a flick of his hand, several rays of spiritual power appeared, and a series of seals appeared to block the sword lights. Puff, puff, puff. The green and red sword lights crisscrossed in the air and streaked across like lightning. The defensive seals that the golden core disciple used were all pierced by the sword lights. Not good. When the disciple saw this, he was even more shocked. The spiritual power in his body surged and golden light shined around him as if he was activating a magic treasure to protect his body. Li Jijie also hurriedly pointed with his finger again. The flying sword that was knocked away paused for a moment before slashing toward the dozen rays of green and red sword lights. The two rays of green and red sword lights that penetrated the magic treasure were especially fast. The moment the magic treasure appeared, the sword light landed on the disciple's body. It was like a silk thread that wrapped around the disciple's neck. The sword light wrapped around the early-stage golden core cultivator's neck. The protective magic treasure glowed with an extremely resplendent brilliance, and this brilliance flashed violently. However, in front of Li Jijie and the hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators, the golden light protecting the golden core cultivator was instantly annihilated. The golden core cultivator's head flew up, and a pillar of blood spurted high into the air. At this time, Li Jijie's sword light had just touched the dozen rays of green and red sword light. This time, the weapon cultivator who suddenly attacked didn't attack. He just stood in the air and laughed. The dozen rays of sword light seemed to have intelligence. The moment they touched Li Jijie's sword light, they immediately dodged and flew into the green and red sword pillar and disappeared. Li Jijie's flying sword actually hit nothing. Damn it. When Li Jijie saw that one of his Changbai sect's golden core disciples had been killed and his attack had failed, he was shocked and enraged. Since Li Jijie and the other golden core cultivators were shocked, how could the hundreds of thousands of foundation establishment and Qi refinement cultivators not be scared? Chapter 2662. Idiot. Seeing that Li Jijie was about to go into battle, Hung Feng couldn't help but curse in his heart. He flew out and said, "Fellow Daoist Li, look at the big picture. Don't mess up your formation. There are tens of thousands of sword lights, hundreds of thousands of sword cultivators. Although you and I are golden core cultivators, it won't be easy to deal with them." When Li Jijie heard this, he snorted coldly and stopped in the air. His eyes were fixed on the corpse of that disciple and the other 3 disciples who had landed beside him with shocked expressions. Where did this sword cultivator come from? How dare he launch a sneak attack without announcing his name? Hung Feng looked at the old man with a strange glow around him and knew that this old man was a weapon cultivator. As expected, the old man showed a trace of arrogance and said, "I am Ming Changsho from the Flying Feather Sect. You're also a nobody." Hung Feng said indifferently, "Although I'm a nobody, I can do things that will shock the world." Ming Changsho's expression changed slightly and he sneered, "After this battle, my name will definitely resound throughout the 3 cultivation countries." Ha ha ha! With just the sword formation? Hung Feng laughed loudly and then looked at the east where the sky had already turned white amidst the drizzling rain. He said, "Did the sun rise from the west today?" Formations have always been the ultimate technique that our Dao sect cultivators rely on. When did it become a weapon that sword cultivators use to attack our Dao sect? Caw! Another clear cry was heard. This cry sounded like that of a bird, yet wasn't. It was extremely ear-piercing. Many aura-refining disciples who heard this cry felt as if their hearts were being pricked by needles, causing them to lose their footing. An old man wearing a strange gray robe flew out from the other side of the sword pillar. He had a flat, round head, large eyes, and two of his eyes emitting a faint grayish-yellow light. Looking at this old man's slightly pointed nose and long eyelashes, as well as the fine and thick feathers on his face, all the cultivators knew that this old man must be a bird cultivator. So, these nondescript, heretical cultivators have all come to the Sword Catacomb to set up formations. Hung Feng seemed to have understood something. I am Liang of the Kunmu Valley. I have been ordered by Lu Ruochang to set up this great sword formation. I have been waiting for you for a long time. The old man's voice was sharp, and he quickly finished speaking in one breath. He spoke so quickly that Hung Ming was stunned. It took him several breaths to react. Hung Zhao rolled his eyes and raised his voice. Where is Lu Ruochang? Is she hiding just like that? Does she not dare to meet her old friend? Oof, what old friend? We are enemies. LV Jinyu is the best strategist among the warriors of the sword domain. As long as she commands us, we will naturally fight to the death. Why we need her to come and see you? Liang said in a clear voice. Heh, Hung laughed coldly. She's probably scared by this old man's array. Isn't she? You become a coward. At this point, Hung felt that it was inappropriate. If this was the three kingdoms of cultivation, all the cultivators would be furious at the mention of a coward. However, there was no lack of beast cultivators in the Hung Kingdom. The old man in front of him looked like an owl or a parrot. Who would care about being a coward? Sure enough, Liang did not care. He said coldly, all this nonsense is useless. We have set up a sword formation here in the Sword Catacomb. You and I will meet in the sword formation. You only need to break the sword formation, and LV Jinyu will definitely face you. As he spoke, Li Ying's gray sword robes flapped as if he was about to fly away. Liang, I am Xiong Huasong of the Black Heaven sect. Xiong Huasong would not let go of the opportunity to ask. He hurriedly stepped forward and asked, let me ask you, what is the name of your sword formation? You want to know the name of this sword formation? Liang stopped. A strange light flashed in his grayish-yellow eyes. That's right. Xiong Huasong nodded. What is the name of the great formation that your Dao sect set up earlier? Liang asked hesitantly. That great formation is my Black Heaven sect's 10-direction annihilation formation. Xiong Huasong replied without hesitation. Liang's eyelids twitched rapidly. Then, he replied, I'm not afraid to tell you. This is the Yin-Yang sword formation. If you have any tricks up your sleeves, feel free to use them. I'd like to see how you'll break the formation. When was this sword formation set up? Xiong Huasong quickly asked. When was your 10-direction annihilation formation set up? Liang clearly wanted to know when the Dao sect set up the formation in the Sword Catacomb. Xiong Huasong hesitated for a moment. He glanced at Hung and said, it was only a few months ago. A few months ago? Liang was extremely surprised. They had been setting up the formation for several years under LV Ruochang's orders and had finally completed it. They were just waiting for LV Ruochang and the rest to lure the Dao sect cultivators into the formation. However, a 10-direction annihilation formation had suddenly appeared beside the four-corner sword formation. To be honest, Liang and the rest were even more surprised than Xiong Huasong and the rest. They wanted to know when the Dao sect cultivators had set up the Great Formation. Of course, Li Ying and the rest also understood that the sword cultivators had been suppressing the Dao sect's attacks. The battle lines had already penetrated deep into the country of Shi and the country of Lian. They had never expected the Dao sect cultivators to set up a formation in the Sword Catacomb. Therefore, the defense in the Sword Catacomb was very lax. Furthermore, the Sword Catacomb's terrain was very special. They could not possibly detect every single movement in the Sword Catacomb. They could not possibly detect any strange movements in the Sword Catacomb. After all, strange movements were normal in the Sword Catacomb. If it was normal, it would be abnormal. Whose idea was it? Liang asked faster than frying beans. Qian, Xiong Huasong replied without hesitation. Hung Ming asked anxiously. When did you set up the sword formation? It won't be too late to ask after you answer this question. We have been setting up the formation here for more than 8 years under LV Genio's orders. Liang snorted coldly. 8 years. Hung Ming looked at Xiong Huasong. Xiong Huasong's eyes clearly revealed a sense of relief. Forget it. Hung Ming sighed. Now it seems that our previous victories in the Spirit Stone Mine and other places were all part of your plan. You wanted to lure us into the ambush in the Sword Catacomb? We are not very clear about the battle on the front lines. Liang did not hide anything and said proudly, those were all done by LV Ruochang and LV Jianyu. We were only waiting here for you to fall into the trap and kill you all. As the saying goes, the onlooker sees more clearly. Although Hung Ming and the others were involved in the planning of the great battle of Dao cultivators, when they turned their heads to look at the situation of the battle, they were like onlookers again. Many details were clear at a glance, and were far more clear than when they were sitting in the meeting hall of Sky Patrol City, talking nonsense. Only when they heard that the Yin-Yang sword formation had been set up for more than 8 years did Hung Ming and the others truly realize that the sword cultivators of the Hung Kingdom were not as weak as they thought. They had planned for a long time. At the same time, Hung Ming and the others were extremely emotional as they thought of 2 people, Tu Hong and Qian Mo. Both of them had already fallen and were not regarded as cultivators in their eyes. If it wasn't for Tu Hong's arrogant wish to create another Golden Spring Mountain in the Sword Tomb, and Qian Mo's close relationship with Tu Hong due to Dui Qiming's matter, he would have selflessly mentioned it in the meeting hall and had his own ideas. If it wasn't for this, the Dao sect cultivators would never have thought of setting up a formation in the Sword Tomb, let alone a 10-direction annihilation formation. However, the cultivators' indifferent and indifferent actions actually brought them a pleasant surprise. If not for Hung Ming's greed and Ji Hong's arrogance in killing the sword cultivators, the Dao sect would have almost won this time, and this great battle of Dao cultivators would almost be over. But the Dao of Heaven was clear. Because of Hung Ming and the others' greed, they had fallen into the sword formation that LV Ruochang had painstakingly set up for 8 years. After hearing Li Ying's words, Hung Ming and the others already knew that this yin-yang sword formation was not something that the sword formations they had encountered previously could compare to. Indeed, with a long cry from Li Ying, the green and red sword pillars shone brightly and covered the figures of Xiao Jie, Yang Jiuding, Meng Changshou, and the others. Within the large formation, within a radius of 10 miles, where the earth had trembled previously, there were now flashing sword lights. These sword lights were only green and red, and they were like bamboo shoots after the rain, shooting out from the ground. Disciples. Hung Ming hurriedly ordered, "Kill! Kill!" The disciples heard the order and shouted in unison. That shout reverberated throughout the large formation, and the fear from before seemed to have dissipated significantly. At the same time as Hung Ming gave the order, the green and red sword pillars flashed. The green and red sword lights split into thousands of sword lights and sprayed in all directions like a skyrocketing fountain. The sword lights that drilled out from the ground also let out sword cries and rushed into the air. They formed a joint attack with the sword lights of the sword pillars and pierced towards the cultivators from above and below. Not only that, the sword lights that Li Zongbao had seen previously absorbed the surrounding spiritual energy of heaven and earth and the sword intents of many remnant swords from dozens of miles away, attacking the hundreds of thousands of cultivators trapped in the center from all directions. Xiong Huasong saw the power of the yin-yang sword formation and could not help but gasp. He thought to himself, This sword formation is not much inferior to the metal destruction formation. Although the sword lights had yet to reach the cultivators, the wind and clouds in the entire large formation changed drastically. Sword chi swept out like a huge beast's mouth, swallowing everyone. The green and red sword lights were the fangs of the ferocious beast. Although the thousands of green and red sword lights could not be compared to the yin-yang sword lights released by second-grade illusory swordsmen like Xiao Jie and yang jioting. Their power was definitely not to be underestimated. Attack! In the blink of an eye, the yin-yang sword lights pierced towards the cultivators. How could the formation that the cultivators had formed dare to be careless? They hurriedly channeled their magic power and took out their magic weapons and treasures. Tens, hundreds, and even thousands of treasures flashed and smashed towards the green and red sword lights. Rumble within the sword formation. The first rumble was heard. Then, the rumbles continued to explode, one after another, each louder than the last. The dozens of disciples of the Black Heaven sect formed a strange formation. After they took out their magic weapons, flames soared into the sky, and hundreds of huge fireballs hit the sword light that was coming from above. Chapter 2663. Pa, pa, pa. A series of explosions rang out in the air like firecrackers lit by children. The moment the 100 or so fireballs came into contact with the sword light, they were all sliced apart by the green and red sword light. They couldn't stop the sword light from penetrating deeper. However, at the same time that the fireballs exploded, the brilliance of the sword light also dimmed, and the sword chi also weakened. A series of blood-curdling screams came from the Clear Leaf sect disciples. The green and red sword light had broken through the formation of more than 10 chi refinement disciples. The green and red sword light cut through the necks, waists, and even legs of these disciples as if they were weeding grass. Whenever the green and red sword light flashed past the bodies of these disciples, their bodies would be sliced open by the sword light. As blood spurted out, their corpses also fell from the sky. Illusion? Right, illusion. A mid-foundation establishment disciple saw that he couldn't block the red sword light that was slashing between his brows and felt his soul leave his body. However, when the sword light fell, he didn't sense any abnormalities. He immediately understood that the countless green and red sword lights that covered an area of several kilometers weren't all sword lights. Some of them were illusions of the sword formation. However, just as this disciple shouted, 2 more sword lights flew over in pairs. The disciple hastily activated his magic treasure to block them. However, a thin crack appeared on his magic treasure from the sword light. It was obviously not an illusion. Thus, the disciple became extremely depressed. That's right. Even if you know that there are illusions in the sword light, so what? Can you not use your magic power to block each sword light? Moreover, even if you used all your strength to resist, how many yin-yang sword lights can you resist? The yin-yang sword formation quickly closed up, and the green and red sword lights wantonly crisscrossed. These sword lights were like scythes, reaping the lives of chi refinement cultivators one after another. Their magic treasures and talismans couldn't block these incomparably sharp sword lights at all. These green and red sword lights were also incomparably cruel. Most of them cut through the cultivators' necks. Apart from a small number of cultivators who could barely dodge and scream before they died, the rest of the cultivators had their heads chopped off without a sound. Blood soared into the sky. Thus, not long after, nearly 20% of the chi refinement disciples among the hundreds of thousands of cultivators lost their lives. The pungent smell of blood permeated the entire formation. The drizzling rain couldn't wash away this vicious stench of blood at all. Moreover, countless drops of blood flowed into the ground of the sword tomb along with the rain. The purple jasmine flowers that were washed by the rain earlier became even more beautiful. Sure enough, a sword formation couldn't be compared to a formation. In fact, the two were completely different. The formation used the formation to condense the dermic powers of the disciples to form a powerful attack. This attack focused on the overall power of the formation. On the other hand, a sword formation combined the sword lights of a group of swordsmen. They interacted and strengthened each other, forming an even more powerful sword light and sword chi. This sword formation emphasized a kind of naked slaughter. Attack! Dozens of people from the Huanhua sect formed a formation. A group of Foundation establishment and Shi refinement disciples activated their magic treasures, and a huge, thick, green-colored tree, about 10 zhang long, formed in the air with a rumble. The surrounding spiritual energy of heaven and earth spun violently and was sucked into the green-colored tree formed by many magic treasures. Wu, the green tree flashed around the group of disciples, blocking the 10 or so sword lights of yin and yang. Under their combined efforts, the huge green tree slowly smashed into the ground. Boom! Hundreds of green and red sword lights rushed out from the ground and pierced into the green tree. While the runes on the surface of the green tree were corroded, they also blocked the sword lights. Under the heavy pressure and confinement, the sword lights curved. As the green tree fell to the ground, a huge roar erupted. At the same time, the cries of swords rang out endlessly. When a greenwood splendor rushed into the ground, circles of green splendor violently overflowed. It actually struck the swords until they dimmed, and many of them even disappeared. Seeing that the attack was effective, the disciples of the Huanhua sect almost cheered in unison. However, just as they were about to activate their mana again with a smile on their faces, more than 10 rays of green-red sword light flew towards them from the side. They slanted and were about to stab into the formation they had formed. In this yin and yang sword formation, the green and red yin and yang sword lights were like fish in water. Every time 2 green and red sword lights interacted, their speed was extremely fast. Moreover, there were many sword lights crisscrossing each other. Who would be able to distinguish them in time? By the time the crowd could distinguish the 10 or so sword lights, they were already in front of them. The Foundation establishment disciples in the formation were better off. They hurriedly activated the flying spell and tried their best to dodge. However, the aura refining disciples had just activated their vital chi. Now that they hurriedly activated their flying talismans, they were not as agile as the Foundation establishment disciples. There was not much space for them to dodge. As the 10 or so sword lights flashed, another 10 or so lives were lost. The 10 or so aura refining disciples were scared out of their wits. Their faces were ashen, and the joy from before was still frozen on their faces. Their eyes flashed with infinite terror. At this critical moment, the crisp cry of a phoenix sounded from the left side of the disciples. Then a thin azure blue screen quickly spread out from the side of the disciples. A voice that was very similar to the cry of a phoenix said crisply, "Don't look at this primordial water. Focus on defeating the enemy." The dozens of sword lights rushed into the thin blue screen, but they only managed to penetrate an inch deep before they were disintegrated by the Daos like rays of light that shot into a polygonal crystal. All the Daos disappeared. "Thank you, Senior Sister Hong Xia." The 10 or so Foundation establishment and aura refining disciples were overjoyed when they heard this voice. They obediently moved their divine senses and gazes away from the thin screen. With a cheer, they formed a formation again and slowly activated their magic power. Looking at the side of the crowd, Fairy Hong Xia was wearing a crimson red robe. She released a phoenix celestial body that was 10 feet in size. The ice phoenix was controlling the innate primordial water to protect the crowd. Xiao Hua defeated Ji in the 7 Extremes Ridge as a nameless person and forced Ruasi to retreat with hundreds of thousands of swordsmen. The thunder-controlling sect, Huanhua sect, and other Dao sect disciples occupied the 7 Extremes Ridge's Spirit Stone Mine. Then, under the command of the Sky Patrol City's conference hall, Fairy Hong Xia and the others attacked the swordsmen who were not too far away under Ming Yu's leadership. Then, when the swordsmen were defeated, they chased them to the Sword Tomb. As for the Imperial Thunder sect, because Kan Sheng had seen Wu Ming's so-called Imperial Thunder Shock with his own eyes, he was sent back to the Imperial Thunder sect for questioning. The disciples of the Imperial Thunder sect did not stop at the 7 Extremes Mountains. Instead, they were sent to the Clear Cave. In the Sword Tomb, the Huanhua sect was in charge of the Ice Destruction Array. Because Fairy Hong Xia had the Ice Phoenix celestial body and her physique was of the ice element. She was more effective in the array than the ordinary Foundation establishment disciples. Even the Golden Core, Cultivator Ming, Yu stayed by Fairy Hong Xia's side to protect her. Of course, Fairy Hong Xia did not disappoint. She played a great role in killing the Huanjin sect. When the sword cultivators broke the formation and retreated in defeat, Fairy Hong Xia finally felt relieved. She knew that the battle was over. She had contributed a lot to Huanhua. She was overjoyed. She was thinking about how to tell Mingyu and let Xiao Hua accompany her to the ancestral home of the Kai clan. Unfortunately, Fairy Hong Xia's joy was only for a moment. Many Huanhua sect disciples flew out of the array and went deep into the sword tomb to chase after the defeated sword cultivators. Fairy Hong Xia did not know what others were thinking, but she was extremely unwilling to chase after them. Not to mention the dangers of the sword tomb. The results of the ice destruction array were enough to satisfy her. Moreover, Fairy Hong Xia knew the principle of not chasing after a cornered enemy. Unfortunately, Fairy Hong Xia was only a disciple in the late Foundation establishment stage. Even Mingyu, who was beside her, did not have the chance to speak. What did she do? When the hundreds of thousands of cultivators entered the yin-yang sword formation, Fairy Hong Xia was also burning with anxiety. While she defended against the enemy with Mingyu, her beautiful eyes looked around, desperately trying to find traces of Xiaohua. She knew that in such a dangerous situation, only her lover Xiaohua could protect her, right? Speaking of Xiaohua, Fairy Hong Xia felt an indescribable sweetness in her heart. Besides this sweetness, there was also a trace of bitterness. She wanted to see Xiaohua now, but she did not want Xiaohua to appear now. The reason was simple. Ever since the Seven Extremes Mountains, Fairy Hong Xia had no news of Xiaohua. She also did not see Li Zongbao and Xiao Mao. However, the tidal beads and connate primordial water that Xiaohua gave her had saved her life many times, ensuring that she would be fine in the battle. As for Fairy Hong Xia's magic treasure, Crimson Drill, it had been damaged by Yun Bai in the Seven Extremes Mountains. Although it had recovered a lot after some simple refinement, it was not very useful in this battle. Every time Fairy Hong Xia used the connate primordial water, she would think of her lover and her heart would be filled with sweetness. However, ever since the Seven Extremes Mountains battle, Mingyu, who had a good impression of Fairy Hong Xia, took care of Fairy Hong Xia even more because of Fairy Hong Xia's performance. What made Fairy Hong Xia unhappy was that this golden core female cultivator, who regarded her as a direct descendant, would occasionally talk to her about the non-existent John Doe. She did not seem to look down on John Doe because of his looks. Instead, her tone was full of admiration. With Fairy Hong Xia's intuition as a female cultivator, she could even feel that Mingyu had feelings for John Doe. Of course, although Fairy Hong Xia's cultivation and age could not be compared to Mingyu's, she was born in an aristocratic family and had the fate of being together with Xiaohua. She was not inferior to Mingyu in matters of love. She also knew that this was just a feeling that was dispensable. If she did not have the chance to interact with John Doe, this feeling would not be considered a feeling at all. However, if she had the chance to interact with John Doe, this feeling could immediately turn into a web of love. Therefore, Fairy Hong Xia did not know whether to laugh or cry. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.